Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Piranha Bytes loves to make RPG trilogies. The newest game from this studio came out just a couple of months ago and it was a direct sequel to Elex 1 from 2017. Judging by everything we know about this sequel and the history of the studio, we can say for sure that Elex 3 is inevitable. That will complete the Elex trilogy, just like they did with Gothic and Risen series. The first Risen game was a fresh beginning for this small developer.
You not listening? Someone spit in your ear?
Creating a brand new IP is always a big risk, even when it comes to AAA games, let alone a small budget RPG from a studio with around 30 people. But Piranha Bytes already established a very loyal fan base with Gothic games, even though Gothic 3 was considered to be a major disappointment, mainly because it felt unfinished. Then it got even worse with the awful standalone spin-off, which was The Forsaken Gods. Even though that game wasn't developed by Piranha Bytes, it only added more fuel to the fire which Gothic 3 started. It seemed like everything was going downhill until we got a brand new game from this studio. Risen was a chance for a new beginning. This game was something entirely new from the Gothic developer, but they kept the same design philosophy which made their previous games so beloved. In a lot of ways, Risen felt like Gothic 1 and 2, but in a different skin. It's maybe not the game which the fans wanted, but the game which the fans needed.
But isn't that terribly dangerous?
That's because people expected to see another Gothic game from this studio, but unfortunately that was impossible. Back then, Piranha Bytes lost the license for the Gothic IP, although only temporarily. The license went to Joe Wood, which was the ex-publisher of Gothic games. Joe Wood got the rights to develop a game within the Gothic universe, so they hired a new studio to make Arcania. But that's a totally different story that we're going to talk about in the next video. Making a completely new game was the only option for Piranha Bytes, but it didn't seem like Risen was developed out of pure necessity. Judging by the general quality of this game, it seems like Piranha Bytes wanted to move on from the Gothic franchise anyway. However, Risen was not without its problems, and some of them are quite big, especially in later chapters. Ironically, I think it suffers from similar issues that Gothic 3 had when it comes to feeling unfinished. Despite that, I still believe it's very much worth playing today, especially if you never played it before. So we'll talk about the good, the bad, and everything I consider important about Risen 1 in this video. I completed a playthrough on my PC, and I also played the infamous Xbox 360 version just to see how bad it actually was. Yeah, I'm suffering so you don't have to. You're welcome. Now let's go back to the beginning and start analyzing every major aspect of this game.
You telling tales now?
The reception of Risen was pretty decent in general, even though it was far from being a highly anticipated game. Well, it was decent on the PC at least. Like I said, the Xbox 360 port was absolutely terrible. But we'll talk about this version of the game a bit later in the video. Risen starts with a short cutscene which gives you a pretty vague introduction of what's going on in this world. Apparently, the gods were treating the people as slaves for a long time on this world, so people eventually managed to banish them. Banishing the gods set in motion the sudden appearance of temple ruins all over the world. The main story is heavily revolved around these temples, and you'll spend a lot of time exploring them in later chapters. And speaking of you, once again you get to control a nameless character, just like in Gothic games. There is basically no background story or any additional info about the character you play. It's entirely up to you to shape his personality through dialogue and different gameplay choices, which are quite prominent in this RPG. And even though the character customization system would fit perfectly with such RPG design, Piranha Bytes just refuses to include that feature in their games. I really think they don't realize how many people love customizing their own characters in RPGs. The last two games from this studio had a well-established main character with a rich backstory. When you have predetermined characters like Jax from Elex, Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher, and so on, the lack of any customization options is more forgiving. However, Greedfall, for example, also had a predetermined character, but that didn't stop the developer from including a comprehensive character customization system. I think it's a missed opportunity with Risen because this feature alone will probably attract more people. Anyway, ever since the temples have risen from the ground, the Inquisition has set some very strict rules.
The Inquisitor has his claws stuck deep into the flesh of this island, a firm grip on the harbour town and the monastery. Well, that's what he thinks.
The Inquisitor Mendoza is featured in the intro cutscene where he tries to fight this big titan monster unsuccessfully. So he disappears from the boat, leaving the crew behind to perish, including you. But somehow you manage to survive, and now you're stranded on this unknown island where the game begins. The island is called Faranga, although the name is rarely mentioned by anyone in the game, which is kinda weird. I had to check the damn wiki page just to be sure about the name. This might seem like a nitpick, but I actually think it's really important to emphasize the name of the game world as much as possible, especially if it's a brand new RPG with a fresh lore. Luckily for Risen, the map itself is amazing and very memorable, but we'll talk about the map design when we get to the gameplay. Like I said, the Inquisition has set some very strict rules ever since the temples have risen from the ground. No one is allowed to leave the island, and it's basically illegal to be a free man. Yeah, they really seem like great people, don't they?
The guards brought you here because you transgressed the law.
I didn't know it was forbidden to be outside the town.
Ignorance is no excuse.
The Inquisition is one of the joinable factions in the game, and they are not playing around when it comes to their laws. There is a big chance to accidentally join them by just being curious while exploring the island. The higher members of Inquisition will attack you on sight and knock you down, and drag you to the monastery by force. If that happens, you'll have no choice but to join them or reload a save game. However, Risen has a great subtle tutorial which will introduce you to a couple of very useful characters. Sarah is another survivor from the boat, and she gives you some very basic gameplay tips and the first quest. Shortly after that, you'll meet Jen, who will give you some very useful tips about the island. And he can actually accompany you and show you the way to a couple of important locations. Jen is a member of the second biggest faction in the game, which is also joinable. People just refer to them as bandits or the Dawn's people. The Dawn was the leader of the harbor town, but when the Inquisition came, they took over the control of the city. Eventually, you'll have to make a choice between these two factions, but there are plenty of side quests to solve even before joining anyone. That's usually the case with all Piranha Bytes games. I decided to join the Dawn's people on this playthrough because I'm pretty sure I beat the game with Inquisition as a mage the last time I played Risen. I would say the process of joining the bandits feels more enjoyable, since you'll have to work for them quite a bit before you can join.
Officially?
Officially, yeah.
Joining the Inquisition is basically instant, either by getting snatched or doing it voluntarily. Although I like how different these two factions are in general. It's not only the process of initiation which is different. The whole game feels a lot different depending on your faction choice. Although the main story for the last two chapters is almost identical, no matter whom you choose. And speaking of that, the game has 4 chapters in total. The first Risen is definitely the shortest game that Piranha Bytes ever made, but it has a strong replay value. Maybe not as much as Gothic games, but you can get at least 2 very interesting playthroughs out of it. The sheer length of the game doesn't really matter that much to me if the game is good in general. But after completing Risen once again, I really feel like the game needed at least 1 more chapter. The first 2 chapters are mostly related to the faction of your choice and the optional side quests, while the last 2 chapters are heavily revolved around the main story of the game. You have to find out what's going on with the island and the mystery behind these ancient temples. The island is suffering from very frequent earthquakes, and it's impossible to sail because of the aggressive storms. Not to mention the huge monster from the beginning cutscene that's probably still there. I will have a separate section where we talk about the spoilers for the main story. It's kinda hard to talk about it in depth without spoiling anything major, but to conclude my spoiler-free thoughts about the main story, it was interesting enough. I was really curious to find out what's really happening with the island, so it does a good job at keeping your attention. The thing is, I forgot the majority of the plot from the last time I played the game, although I still remembered how the game ends. So I guess it was not an extremely memorable main story, at least in my case. The lore of the game is actually very basic, and it leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, sure, we got to see a couple of more recent games, but they went in a totally different direction, and I was not a huge fan of that, especially when it comes to the setting of the game. If you ask me, the setting of the Risen 1 is way superior compared to its sequels. That could be a bit subjective because I prefer medieval/fantasy settings in general. What's not so subjective is the quality of the main story in Piranha Bytes games. To be honest, Gothic games never had an amazing main story, and Risen is not exactly any different. This might sound a bit corny, but when it comes to Gothic games, it was always about the journey, not the destination. That's certainly not an excuse for the bad main story, but that's the thing, I don't think the main story in Risen is bad. The writing is decent, and it was interesting to see what's going to happen next, but the lore itself is pretty bare bones. That's one of the reasons why I think that Risen 1 feels unfinished, but more about that later.
The temple ruins contain many secrets.
By the way, Piranha Bytes have improved the quality of the main story in their newer games quite substantially. So yeah, it's about a journey and not a destination, right? Which brings us back to the beginning section of the game. Choosing where to go in the beginning will have a major impact on how you experience the game. Joining the bandits in the swamp offers you the most freedom when it comes to exploration, as long as you avoid the members of the Inquisition. The game is not afraid to impose a couple of strict rules, which will limit your freedom of movement on the island. For example, if you end up in the monastery, you won't be able to leave until a certain point. You'll have to do a couple of quests first, and then you'll be free to leave and explore the island. Harbor Town takes this concept even more serious. Once you get in, you won't be able to get out that easily because it's officially closed. There are a couple of very interesting quests related to this, but I won't spoil anything. By the way, this place has a ton of quests to solve, so it will keep you busy for quite some time. These restrictions might seem a bit frustrating at first, but once you get your freedom back, it feels amazing and rewarding. Come to think of it, it's very effective gameplay design if done properly. The game briefly shows you the freedom you have on the island, and then eventually it takes it away. It would be a different story if these locations that limit your freedom are boring, but they're not. I think that Harbor Town is way more interesting than the monastery, by the way, when it comes to the location itself. But the monastery has some pretty interesting quests and a very different approach to the main story. The early quests in the swamp are pretty decent as well, although I think the quests you get in the monastery are a bit more interesting. Your main goal is to get a chance to talk with the Don if you want to join him, which is exactly what I did. You'll have a couple of ways to do this by choosing different options while solving quests.
You want me to do this job or not?
This would be a good time to talk about the quests in general. If you played at least one game from this studio, you won't be surprised how the quests work in Risen. They usually give you at least a couple of options to solve a quest, and there are some actual gameplay consequences.
But don't tell him I told you.
It's basically everything you want to see from quests in RPGs. It's not just about choosing between A or B, the depth and the flexibility of these quests might take you by surprise. You can find yourself doing a lengthy side quest, and by the end of it, it turns out it's somehow related to the main quest. A lot of quests are connected, which makes the side quests a lot more enjoyable to do. The options you get while doing a quest just makes them even better. There is actually no way to experience this without replaying the game, which you'll probably do once or twice if you end up liking it. So yeah, the quest system is one of the reasons for such a strong replay value. The game has more than a couple of very memorable characters. However, Risen has a huge problem with different character models or the lack of them. This was a common problem in games with lower budget, especially back then. I had the same criticism for the previous game I covered, which also came out in 2009. Divinity 2 Ego Draconis had the exact same issue. This can still be a problem nowadays for smaller studios, but it's not nearly as bad as it was 13 years ago. What makes Risen characters memorable is their personality and pretty solid voice acting.
With gold. With gold, you can fight power.
The lack of unique looking character models is definitely a big problem, but not to the point where it ruins my experience when interacting with these NPCs. Then we have the dialogue, which is usually extensive, but it never becomes tedious or boring. You always have more than a couple of things to select, either to get some info about the quest, or just something that's usually relevant for the conversation.
Keep searching, Rufo. Yeah, good wolf.
The game has an abundance of NPCs that you can talk to, especially in populated places. One of my favorite things about this dialogue system is the extra XP you can get from just talking to people. The game usually doesn't even tell you about this, so it kinda feels rewarding when you figure it out by yourself. To give you an example, let's say you complete a quest and you no longer have it in your quest log. Then you randomly discover an additional dialogue line with one of the NPCs who were related to the quest, and you get some more bonus XP. It's a really nice touch, and it's nothing new when it comes to Piranha Bytes games. They do this in pretty much all of their games. This only encourages you to initiate a dialogue with everyone, even after you already done the quest they have. I would say this makes the game more dynamic and a bit more immersive. Now let's talk about the visuals. If you played this game only on Xbox back in the day, you will probably think it's one of the worst looking games on that console, but the PC version looks pretty damn good, especially if you can play it in 4K resolution like I did. My PC is average at best for today's standards, and I had to make some compromises when it comes to the graphical settings. I had to set a couple of settings to medium so I can get steady 60 FPS. Well, for the most part at least. I mean, the game is pretty old, but it still looks great and the environment has a lot of detail. The vegetation is extremely dense in some areas, which is one of the major reasons why the environments look so good. Sicily was actually the inspiration for the island of Faranga, and I guess it's not so hard to see the resemblance. The island of Faranga is absolutely gorgeous. And even though we're talking about a single island, a lot of these areas manage to create a distinctive atmosphere. For example, the swamp feels pretty depressive. One of the reasons for that is the subtle fog and just the overall visual design of this place. It's also kinda creepy at night. The majority of other areas are a bit more colorful with brighter atmosphere. However, Risen doesn't exactly have a very bright color palette. The colors are noticeably desaturated actually, but the game still manages to create a warm atmosphere. Although that's not only because of the visuals. All NPCs in Risen have a day and night schedule, just like every other Piranha Bytes game. It's another major reason why these locations feel so lived in and why they create such a great atmosphere. Anyway, it feels to me like the game has a brownish pastel filter. They obviously wanted to replicate the same feeling from the first two Gothic games. But that grimy feel doesn't really work that well in such tropical environment if you ask me. It seems like Piranha Bytes agrees with me on this, because the sequels had much vibrant colors. Maybe not so much when it comes to Risen 2, but Risen 3 had a very bright color palette. The brownish filter of Risen 1 is very dominant, but I don't mind it a lot. Although it does kinda seem forced a bit. I guess the criticism for the vibrant colors of Gothic 3 really got to them. A lot of Gothic games thought this game looks too colorful compared to previous installments. But no matter how you feel about the color palette, the atmosphere in Piranha Bytes games was always amazing and Risen is no different. The textures of the environment are a mixed bag. Well, for today's standards at least. There is a very noticeable difference in pixel count on different environmental assets. Bigger rocks and similar assets have a much lower pixel density compared to something like buildings, trees, and the armor on the character models. That's not a big deal because the game looks pretty damn good on high resolutions anyway, but it's worth mentioning. Fun fact, I'm pretty sure that Gothic 3 had way better pixel density in general. That's kinda mind-blowing if you think about it, because the world in that game was massive, and this game came out before Risen 1. Although that also explains why this game ran like crap. It's the game by the same studio, by the way, if you didn't know already. Saying that it was not optimized is a huge understatement. By the way, I recently did a video about Gothic 3 where I discussed this topic, so you can check that out if you're interested. Yeah, I'm simping for Gothic 3 again, big fucking surprise. Anyway, the worst thing when it comes to visuals in Risen 1 is this permanent film grain effect, I guess. It's a static effect which is the most noticeable in the harbor town on the white buildings. It moves with your camera and it looks ridiculously bad. I wish we can turn it off. As far as I'm aware we can't, but it's not so bad outside the harbor town, I guess. Oh, and by the way, Risen is just another game from that time period that overuses the blur effect. For some odd reason, the majority of game studios back then thought the blur effect is the future, I guess. Now let's talk about the gameplay. I have to say how much I love the early game in Risen. Right from the very beginning, you have more than a couple of different paths to choose and secrets to find if you're curious enough. This might seem logical because it's an open world game after all, but it's not exactly like that. This island is extremely vertical with very dense vegetation and a lot of narrow passages. This means that you can usually get to a certain place on the map by following a single path. So it's not exactly your typical open world map with huge open areas. It does have a couple of wide open areas to explore, but there is a bigger emphasis on the verticality and interconnectivity. More than often, the regular dungeons and caves you get to explore have multiple entrances, so you can use them as shortcuts, which is very useful. Later in the game, you'll find various teleporting stones, which will eliminate a lot of backtracking. Although I think they should be available from the very beginning of the game. I think they become available somewhere in Chapter 3, which is quite late in the game. I guess Piranha Bytes wanted to encourage players to fully explore the map before you get to teleport all over the place. And that's fine, because the exploration in this game is stellar. But you're going to spend quite some time on backtracking before you get those teleportation stones, which can definitely be very annoying, especially because your character moves like this. Yeah, that's your max speed. There is a useful sprint spell that you can get though, even if you're not a mage. I recommend buying this scroll every time you see it on a merchant. Speaking of that, Risen's gameplay has a huge emphasis on a couple of utility spells, up to the point where you can get stuck and cannot progress further if you don't have those spells. I'm not only talking about the side content in the game, this goes for the main story as well. Come to think of it, especially for the main story. Levitation, transformation, and telekinesis are absolutely mandatory in a lot of situations. Risen has a lot of puzzles that you have to solve when you're exploring the temple ruins. These puzzles are not extremely hard to figure out, but they're not brain dead either. I think Piranha Bytes managed to strike a nice balance between challenge and fun when it comes to these puzzles. And it almost always has to do something with those 3 spells I mentioned. Once you figure that out, you know what to look for and what to expect from these puzzles. If you're playing as a mage, those spells will be more accessible. However, even if you're not a mage, it's not really hard to get your hands on a couple of spell scrolls. Although there was a point in the game where I spent around 30 minutes trying to find an appropriate NPC who can sell me some levitation scrolls. It's not a bad idea to learn how to make scrolls, but I decided to dump most of my ability points into sword and strength as soon as possible, because of course I did. Another quite important aspect of Reason's exploration are the maps you're going to collect. I had a lot of praise for Gothic games for having very simple yet very useful in-game maps which you actually have to find or buy. Reason had the same idea, they just took it even further. Unlike most modern open world games, Reason has a very simple map design with just some basic information. But if you ask me, it's all you need from an in-game map. I can't express enough how much I hate the modern idea of an in-game map. That's because they usually feel like a high-tech Google Map system rather than a proper in-game map. Although this depends on the setting of the game itself, I guess. For example, it makes more sense for the Cyberpunk to have a high-tech in-game map with a lot of details, but not so much in The Witcher 3. Where did Geralt get all of this high-tech stuff all of a sudden?
I'm looking for a whore.
Anyway, Reason has a dozen of maps to find and each of them are useful. You start off with no maps at all and you'll quickly find the most basic map. As you progress through the game, you'll find a better world map as well as a lot of local maps of different areas. It's not like you're not able to figure out what to do in Temple Ruins without a local map, but it's a lot easier to get around if you find one. And they also have some subtle tips as well. Reason has a quest map as well, but these are not exactly quest marks. For example, you can see who gave you the quest on the map, and sometimes the location of your objective if there is no reason for it to be hidden. But whenever you get a quest where you have to figure things out by yourself, the quest map won't help you a lot. I'm not a huge fan of quest marks in general, so I like this quite a bit. Come to think of it, this is probably the most natural way of including quest marks without actually including them. For example, the map already has the location of the temples, so the quest marks just show you the location. But if a quest is more mysterious, the game won't have a quest mark that shows you exactly what to do, that's what I mean. It's kinda logical when you think about it.
Just get out of here.
Now let's finally talk about the combat system. Just like the majority of features in Reason, the combat heavily resembles the first 2 Gothic games. The melee combat system is based on combos and the precise timing of your attacks. That means that you'll find the most success with your attacks by pressing the attack button right after the previous attack animation ends. Doing this successfully will make your melee attacks a lot faster than simply spamming the attack button. If you don't time your attacks properly, the attack combo will be noticeably slower, which can get you hit more easily. The feel of this melee combat can be very decent and rewarding once you figure it out. You can also actively block and step dodge to avoid getting hit. Blocking is definitely the most effective defensive move. I try to focus more on the step dodge ability, but blocking just works a lot better, and it's a lot easier to use. The step dodge can be very useful as well, especially against some specific enemy types. More than often, it can leave your opponents open for some free damage, so it's worth using. However, dodging feels very stiff in this game, which can discourage some people from using it. It takes a while for a character to recover from the animation lock, and that's probably the main reason why it feels so stiff. But the core problem of not just the combat system but the controls in general is the camera. First of all, the sensitivity for the camera is way too high and there is no option in the menu to reduce it. This was a much bigger issue on the Xbox version because on PC you can control the sensitivity in Windows. But still, that's not an excuse for the lack of sensitivity options in the menu. Getting used to high sensitivity is not the only issue though. The camera in this game just has a mind of its own. For example, when you're falling down, the camera just refuses to follow your character until you land on something. It feels extremely janky and unpolished. The combat has a soft lock-on system which can keep the enemy at focus as long as you can see their names. When you start attacking, the camera can have very aggressive turns because the camera closely follows the attack animation. And like I said before, it's especially stiff once you use the step dodge. You completely lose the control of your camera until the step dodge animation ends. So no matter how hard you try to turn around and face the enemy, you'll be stuck until the animation ends. But to be fair, when you start attacking, the game is usually smart enough to instantly target the nearest enemy. But still, the camera controls are pretty awful in those situations. The melee combat itself, however, is probably the best that Piranha Bytes ever made. That might not say much, since the melee combat in their games is usually not that great, to put it lightly. But with Risen, they managed to strike a nice balance between the challenge, mechanics, and the general feel of the combat, even though it's far from being amazing. Once you start investing your points into melee combat skills of your choice, it gets even better. Just like in Gothic 1 and 2, you can gradually unlock more moves and animations. For example, lateral attacks makes it easier to hit multiple enemies on the screen. You're usually going to fight multiple enemies anyway, so learning how to do this feels quite rewarding. Although the power attack is probably the strongest move, even against multiple enemies. However, you have to spend a lot of points until you're able to get it. This progression system is a bit more linear compared to something like Gothic 3 and Piranha Bytes' newer games, but it works pretty well. You can't exactly choose which of these combat moves to unlock first, that's what I mean by linear. I went with the two-handed sword on this playthrough and I had a lot of fun, even though my build was pretty simple. I tried to use a bow as well, but I didn't spend a lot of points to improve my dexterity, so my damage was always kinda low with the bow. And to be honest, using a bow in this game doesn't feel really good. It lacks the impact and it feels really floaty. The range gameplay in Gothic 3 was far superior if you ask me. As for the other notable combat moves that you get to unlock, there is a parry mechanic and a counter parry as well. But I feel like this mechanic is not rewarding enough. It's not extremely hard to pull off, but the damage you deal after the parry is usually equivalent to the regular attack. Not always though. Sometimes the enemy will take a lot more damage, so I guess there is a critical chance mechanic or something like that, I can't say for sure. And that extra damage from the parry was only noticeable in the early game. By the time I'd entered chapter 3, it seemed like the damage from the counter parry didn't matter at all. I was still using this mechanic because it can be a great opener even without the extra damage. It's supposed to be a high risk, high reward mechanic, but unfortunately it's only high risk in Risen 1. Speaking about extra damage, I think the balancing of the game is pretty decent when it comes to the hard difficulty. Risen tends to really punish you for your mistakes, which means you can easily get killed, especially in these situations. But at the same time, you can easily mow down multiple enemies on the screen if you position yourself right and execute a good combo. Although I found the power attack the most useful in these situations. You just move out of the way and use your power attack a couple of times. It's probably the safest way to play, if not a bit cheesy. You can still get killed even like this, especially because Risen's combat is very fast paced actually. Compared to the floaty and slow-paced melee combat from Gothic 3, Risen's melee combat is better in every single way possible. Piranha Bytes managed to find a good balance between the challenge and fun, despite some problems I mentioned. The sequel to Risen had a similar idea when it comes to combat, but somehow it managed to feel a lot worse. Risen 3 had some improvements on this field, although the combat in that game can feel really floaty. And the sequels were hyper-focused on the whole pirate theme, to their detriment if you ask me. This pirate setting just puts some big limitations on the combat in general, since you're supposed to fight like a pirate. While Risen 1 gave you a completely blank character with no defined gameplay style. Granted, Risen 1 only had a couple of unique playstyles, but all of them are pretty good. I didn't even mention the mage playstyle, which unlocks if you join the Inquisition. There are some pretty fun spells to cast, and it's arguably the most fun way to experience the game. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of footage of the mage gameplay since I played the game like a warrior. Like I said, you're probably going to beat the whole game at least twice if you end up liking it, so you can experience both of these playstyles. There are different options within these playstyles as well, so it's not like the game only has two different builds. But compared to other Piranha Bytes games, the options you have in Risen are quite limited. Considering the length of the game, Risen 1 offers you just enough options to play your character for at least a couple of playthroughs. When it comes to some other gameplay related things, I just have to mention how awful it feels to jump in this game. Like I said before, the camera is one of the reasons, but jumping by itself is awful. What's also kinda disappointing is the lack of mage enemies throughout the game. 99% of NPCs you're going to fight will face you in melee range. Technically, the Saurians have NPCs who can cast spells, but you can beat the entire game without even knowing that. That's because as soon as you get close to attack them, they'll immediately attack you in melee range. For this whole playthrough, I think I only saw a couple of Saurians in total trying to hit me with a spell. So you don't even have to worry about the magic resistance stat. Items which grant you this protection are completely useless. It's probably a bit different story if you play as a mage, because you'll try to keep the distance between you and the enemies. That will make the mage NPCs actually use their spells, but still, the game has very one-dimensional enemies because it's almost all about the melee combat. Reason has included the ability to grab on ledges, which was absent in Gothic 3. This mechanic is functional enough and it's kinda mandatory for exploring the map. Here's a little tip which will make your exploration a lot better in general. If you do a couple of quests for Patty in Harbor Town, she can teach you the acrobatic skill. You'll thank me later. The itemization in Reason is decent as well. Just like all Piranha Bytes games, Reason is very conservative with the armor sets you can get. You need to progress the rank with your faction so you can unlock a new armor set. Every other miscellaneous item you can equip can be found, bought or crafted. Those are usually going to be rings and amulets. The only reason you have a helmet slot is for the mandatory helmet piece you'll have to equip at the very end of the game. That's a pretty stupid design if you ask me, because the player can spend the whole game hoping to find some helmets to equip. As for the weapons, there is a decent amount of different types to find, and the quantity of weapons is just perfect if you ask me. Especially if we take in consideration that Reason is not a very long game, you'll need about 30 to 40 hours to finish a playthrough. What I really like about weapons in general is that you're able to find them while exploring. And I'm not just talking about common weapons you'll find all over the place. I have found this cool two-hander in one of the temples I explored and I used it quite a bit. The game introduces new weapons and items when you progress through chapters, when merchants will replenish their stock. But my personal preference when it comes to stronger weapons in RPGs is the ability to find them while exploring the world. And Reason didn't disappoint with this. The crafting seems to work a little bit different than you would expect, but I didn't play with it a lot. You can learn how to collect ore from various places on the map, and then you can bring the smith the required materials so he can craft items for you. But you can also craft items for yourself. Speaking about creating items, you can learn how to do alchemy as well. For the majority of my playthrough, I struggle with healing potions, so it's a good idea to stack them whenever you can before you start exploring the map. Learning how to make potions is probably really useful, but I just didn't bother with this skill. Like I said, I wanted to improve my combat skills with the sword as soon as possible. Now you might remember that I mentioned in the beginning that Reason feels unfinished, so let's talk a little bit about that. I already touched upon the underwhelming lore, which is one of the major reasons why the game feels unfinished to me. That's the same reason why I think the game needs at least one more chapter which would possibly focus on the lizard people and their history. The Saurians, I mean. The second major reason is the lack of side quests and things to do in general in the last two chapters. If you did the majority of side quests in the first two chapters, all of a sudden the only thing that's left to do is the main quest. Not to mention that you can fail most of the side quests. I actually love when RPGs have the option to fail the quest, because this makes them feel a bit more real. Piranha Bytes have always held the immersion in high regard, so this really makes sense when you think about it. If something happens in the world and the NPC who gave you the quest disappears or gets killed, it's logical that you'll fail the quest that he gave you. There can be a lot more reasons for failing the quest, these are just the most obvious. But yeah, I feel like the last two chapters should have a lot more quests to do. Either that, or they could have just moved some of these quests for later chapters. It's not like the game lacks the quests in general, you can get a ton of them in the first chapter alone. Although this could also depend on how you play the game, you might discover some of these quests in later chapters. But I assume most people will explore the map as much as possible as soon as they get a chance, which will result in picking up a lot of quests.
So why don't you just fuck off?
Before we start talking about the spoilers, I have to say that the ending of this game is really disappointing. You'll basically spend the whole chapter gathering the pieces for this special armor set, which is the coolest armor set in the game. But you don't even get the chance to properly use it, it's only for the purposes of dealing with the endgame boss. It makes sense from the narrative standpoint, but from the gameplay perspective it's pretty bad. I mean, I don't have to explain why getting the best armor set in the game and only being able to use it for about 10 minutes is bad, right? That brings us on the spoiler section, and you can skip this part by clicking on the next chapter. Your main objective in Reason is to kill the Titan who is threatening to destroy the island. Inquisitor Mendoza believes he can control the Titan, but it turns out he was wrong, unsurprisingly. He actually double-crosses you when you get all the items which are needed to open the main gate in the temple. No matter which side you choose in the beginning, you'll have to work with the Inquisitor Mendoza. And the story always ends the same, there are no multiple endings like in Gothic 3. Once you obtain all of the armor pieces, you can finally step through the gate to face the Titan. But before that, you'll have to fight the Inquisitor. It's a pretty disappointing fight, to be honest, but what's even more disappointing is the fight with the Titan. And there is a very obvious plot hole at the end of the game. Apparently you wouldn't even be able to see the Titan without this ocular that the Inquisitor is using. That explains why no one else saw the Sea Titan in the beginning cutscene. But you don't actually have to equip this item, you only need it in your inventory. You're still going to wear the helmet in these fights. Okay? That's not exactly the worst thing about this fight, not by a long shot. The game thinks it's a good idea to give you some tutorial tips about this fight. What? That's beyond stupid, but what's even worse is the fight itself. Come to think of it, it's not even a fight, it's more of a platforming section. You just need to watch out for the disappearing floor and avoid a couple of attacks from the Titan. Actually, it's only one single ranged attack and it doesn't even matter that much even if it hits you, unless the platform below you disappears. Then eventually you get the opportunity to smack the Titan in the head, and you repeat that a couple of times until the fight is done. It's a terrible boss fight, although the presentation is kinda cool, I'll give it that. I beat the Titan in one single try, even though I completely forgot how the fight works. It's not a very memorable fight, to say the least. I'm not exactly sure if the difficulty affects the fight or not, but it doesn't even matter. The game rolls the credits right after the fight and there is a subtle hint about the sequel. But yeah man, I really wish this game had a more fleshed out lore. The Saurians have a very cool visual design, and it would be very interesting to learn a bit more about them. They could have easily included a couple of passive Saurian NPCs that you could talk to, but nope, they're just a very boring enemy. The people from the Inquisition are worshipping some sort of holy flame, which has to be guarded by any means in the monastery. Even though this thing has a physical form, it's more like an entity than anything else. So it's kinda logical that it remains a mystery throughout the entire game, although it turns out it doesn't really matter that much. The holy flame has to be protected. Why? Nobody knows.
It sounds useful, but I can't do anything with it.
Back to the spoiler-free section. Like I said, the most disappointing thing about this game is the ending. Not to the point where it could ruin your whole experience with the game, but still, it's definitely not good. The second biggest problem that I had might be a bit subjective. I just think the game feels unfinished, and I already explained why. Despite all of that, I still think that Risen is one of the best games from this studio. It's not exactly good as GOTY games if you ask me, but it came close to that. Risen games had an amazing potential, but the sequels were mediocre games at best, unfortunately. We'll cover the sequels in some of the future videos, don't worry. A couple of months ago, I ranked all Piranha Bytes RPGs in one of my videos, and if you wanna see how I ranked Risen, make sure to check that out. When it comes to the music, the great Kai Rosekrantz was the composer for the Risen soundtrack. This is the same guy that composed the music for GOTY games, and once again, he did a phenomenal job. The tracks in this game are simply amazing, and they fit perfectly within the setting of this game. As for the sound effects, it's a mixed bag. The environmental sound effects are pretty good, and this is another reason for that great atmosphere which the game seamlessly creates. The combat sound effects are mediocre at best, but they give a certain weight to their attacks. And I think they sound a lot better compared to the sound effects from the sequels, by the way. Although I wish that some of them are a bit louder, like the blocking effects. The voice acting is pretty good in the game.
Go and find if my people are still loyal. One more thing.
Yes.
The Inquisitor. Gather all the information you can about him.
I'm pretty sure that all major characters have unique voices and they sound pretty good. Although you're going to hear the same voice actor for different NPCs, and it's not so hard to tell.
We found a sword pommel. Show a little respect, little fish.
But considering the amount of NPCs you're going to talk to, it's to be expected. A lot of voice actors have a British accent, and I guess that's also to be expected since the game is made in Europe.
I want payment. A decent payment, or you can both piss off.
You can't go wrong with British accents, by the way. Now let's talk about the infamous Xbox version. I bought the digital version on the Xbox store for my Xbox One. This is probably one of the worst ways you can spend $20, by the way. This console port is obviously not done by Piranha Bytes, they obviously hired a studio to port the game. And whoever developed this port did an awful job. But those guys are not the only one to blame, because apparently it was done under the close supervision of Piranha Bytes. First of all, the game looks like crap, especially compared to the PC version. Some of these textures look like they came straight from the late 90s game, it's that bad. They obviously did this to try and optimize the performance, but they did a horrible job with this as well. Your eyes are going to bleed from the low FPS when you try to explore the populated areas. I can't exactly measure the FPS on the console, but I can say for sure this is lower than 20 FPS. Now listen, I don't have a problem with playing games on 30 FPS as long as the frame rate is somewhat consistent. But this kind of performance is totally unacceptable. However, when I did some research, it seems like the current gen Xbox consoles fixed the frame rate issue. Reason seems to run at 60 FPS on Xbox Series X, which is great. It still looks like crap though. Putting all of that aside, the Xbox version has some serious issues with the controls. I already touched upon the sensitivity issues, which is predominantly a problem on the Xbox version of the game. The camera controls have a crazy high sensitivity and there is nothing you can do about it. But what's even worse in my opinion are the combat controls. That's because it's very easy to accidentally press the jump button when you want to use the step dodge. This is because the game uses the same button for jumping and dodging. But the PC doesn't have this issue, even though it uses the same button to jump and dodge as well. You can use the strafe buttons on PC and easily step dodge because you never have to press W button to move forward. That's obviously not the case with the Xbox controller since you're going to move with the left stick. It's much easier to mess this up and it makes dodging very tedious. And that's pretty much everything I have to say about this god-awful Xbox port. Whatever you do, don't play it. The first Risen game was a very strong beginning of the new Piranha Bytes IP. After the announcement for Risen 2, I expected we were going to see an even better sequel. That was kinda logical to expect because Gothic 2 was a phenomenal sequel, which just took everything that was good about the first game, improved it in a lot of ways, and continued the story. That was exactly what I expected from Risen 2, because it seemed like this small studio was once again on the right track with this new IP.
Ahoy, laddie. Nice place to feel the wind in your hair, eh?
Risen 1 had its fair share of problems that we discussed in the retrospective video, but overall, it was a very strong RPG in general. Especially for a brand new IP, even though it felt very similar to Gothic 1 and 2, which was a good thing if you ask me. After the first trailer for Risen 2 dropped, I was immediately very skeptical. It was obvious that the setting for the game drastically changed, which was not fundamentally a bad thing, quite the opposite actually. When a game developer tries something different, you can usually see the passion they have for creating new games, especially when it comes to smaller studios which are not afraid to take some risks. However, switching the medieval fantasy setting to 17th century inspired pirate setting just didn't sit right with me.
Gods give me strength.
It's not like this design decision came out of nowhere. The first Risen game had some mentions of pirates, and Patty, the daughter of the famous pirate Steelbeard, was one of the main characters in Risen 1. But I highly doubt that anyone would imagine that the sequel will be entirely based around pirates. Since the immersion is quite possibly the most important aspect of Piranha Bytes games, that automatically meant they would have to change the entire game design philosophy to better fit the new pirate setting.
That might not have been a good idea, lad.
Almost everything they established in the first game was going to be scrapped and they would have to start from the very beginning. The combat system, the progression and the exploration have undergone some major changes to go along with the new pirate setting and the story. Instead of just building upon the very solid foundation from the first game, like they did with Gothic 2, they instead did a 180 move and redesigned everything, which would only make sense if the first game didn't do so well, but it did. Well, the port for Xbox 360 was awful, but the PC version of the game managed to score some very decent reviews all around. Let me just put it this way, I wouldn't have any issues with the pirate setting if it was actually done well.
Don't shoot the messenger, sir.
So what was exactly the problem with this game? Well, let's start from the beginning. It doesn't take long to notice some improvements when it comes to visuals compared to the first game. The major improvement will be the quality of character models. They are substantially more detailed compared to the first game, and I was generally surprised with the number of unique looking characters in the game. There are still clones of some less important characters like regular NPCs or blacksmiths, just like in the first game. but it's nowhere near as bad as in Risen 1. Risen 2 managed to create some very memorable characters, and only partly because of the higher graphical fidelity, but we'll get to that. The second improvement I like when it comes to how the game looks is the absence of that yellow/brownish filter which made the first game look worse than it should be. The color palette in Risen 2 is very pleasant for the eyes. Unfortunately, that's pretty much everything positive I have to say about the graphics. The game world in Risen 2 looks extremely generic, especially for Piranha Bytes standards. Risen 2 has by far the most uninspired game world that Piranha Bytes ever made. Splitting the game world into multiple islands makes sense from the story perspective, but this ended up being one of the weakest features in the game. There is barely anything unique about these islands, all of them look very similar, except for some major points on the map. Yeah, points. Risen 2 doesn't have any major places like the monastery or the harbor town from the first game. Technically, it has a lot more populated places compared to Risen 1, but this is the school example of quantity over quality. The visual variety is extremely poor in this game. Exploring the wilderness of each and every island in the game looks and feels almost identical. There are some exceptions here and there, but even those exceptions are not noteworthy, they just look different, not better. They are still boring and uninspired. Before we dig deeper in the game world and exploration, I want to start talking about the story first.
So the High Council has finally decided on the evacuation issue?
Not yet. They want us to explore the new world more before we abandon Caldera.
Bloody fools!
It took me a while to realize that we're actually playing as the same protagonist from the first game. But I don't think you should blame me, because the story in this game doesn't make a lot of sense in the beginning. The story is actually the only thing that keeps the game together, believe it or not. If we ignore the plot holes, which became obvious because of the change of setting. No, but seriously, how do we go from the magic-oriented Inquisition that trains monks with staffs and crystal magic to musket-wielding 17th century colonists? Am I missing something here? I don't know. Do you just wake up one day and find yourself in a parallel universe? Because that's exactly how the beginning of the game feels. You wake up on the island of Caldera, which is the main base of Inquisition. The intro cutscene is not even a cutscene. The narrator just rambles a little bit about the Titans and that's pretty much it. From the very beginning, the sequel feels a bit rushed and underdeveloped. Risen 1 had a very cool intro cutscene, which did a great job to set up the beginning of the story. Risen 2 is the first and pretty much the last time I felt like Piranha Bytes lost the ambition and drive to make a good RPG. They had a pretty good cinematic trailer for Risen 2, but it wouldn't make a lot of sense to use it in an intro cutscene, I guess. Anyway, one of the members of the Inquisition wakes you up and gives you some shit about your drunken behavior. Apparently you are a disgrace for the Inquisition, even though you killed a fire titan not so long ago. Yeah, remember that? You might miss the connection with the original protagonist from the first game until your character mentions it once or twice during some random dialogue. Whatever, you wake up drunk and now you have to talk with Commander Carlos. You can see that almost the entire island of Caldera is burning in the distance. Probably because of the Titans and the constant Kraken attacks, I guess, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm pretty sure this is never explained in the game, but I could have missed something. Shortly after you leave the room, you will get a cutscene where you see Patty fighting sand devils on the coast. Patty is a returning character from Risen 1 and the daughter of the legendary pirate captain Steelbeard. We heard about him in the first game a lot, but we never got to meet him. Well, that changes in this game because he's one of the major characters. Anyway, Patty tells you that she's here to deliver an important message to Inquisition. There is an abrupt cut in this dialogue scene and you immediately start talking with Carlos. Once again, it feels weird and rushed. Patty informs you that her father Steelbeard is searching for a weapon to defeat Mara, and also the sea monster Kraken, which is sinking Inquisition ships. Kraken is one of the Mara's creatures, by the way. Mara is a Titan Lord and the main antagonist of this game. Your ultimate goal is to stop her, and the main story is completely revolved around this. Patty also tells you that there is a war between pirate captains because some of them sided with Mara, while her father is leading the opposition. He is currently on Tacarigua Island, which is your next destination and where the game essentially begins. Carlos tells you that you have to work undercover basically and join the pirates so you can stop the Kraken. That means that you're officially out of the Inquisition, and he strictly tells you that you should try to hide any connection you had with them. Otherwise the pirates would want to kill you. But that's not true, because I used every opportunity to tell people about my past with the Inquisition and there are no consequences whatsoever.
few years back I was with the Inquisition, under a foul-tempered goat fiddler named Mendoza. On Faranga, we had to lock a titan back in its cage.
You were a protector once.
Yeah, but it feels like a lifetime ago. Times have changed, as you see.
That's for sure, Sport.
That didn't bother me a lot, but what I did found stupid about this is when you get to decide which faction to join. This is yet another undercooked feature of this game. Piranha Bytes games always offer you some meaningful decisions you have to make, especially when it comes to joining a faction. It's always a big deal in their games, and something went terribly wrong with Reason 2. This game has very underwhelming choices, and they don't make a lot of sense. A bit later in the game, you get the option to join, get this, the Inquisition or the Natives. Even though the game explicitly tells you that you should not have any connections with the Inquisition in order to blend in with the pirates. You become a pirate anyway, but you reach a point in the main story where you have to choose who to join, the Inquisition or the Natives. There are no different ranks you get to obtain no matter who you join, which automatically makes the progression worse because ranking up within a faction was always heavily connected with the progression in Piranha Bytes games. To less extent in Reason 1, but the sequel totally abandoned this idea. And you also become a pirate captain very early in the game with pretty much zero effort. Look, maybe they wanted to make a more casual action adventure. That would be the only logical explanation for this sudden change of game design philosophy. But if you hold this game to the same standards as previous RPGs from this studio, you're going to be disappointed and confused.
Wise and clever old fucker!
To go back to the story, your main goal is to collect all weapons to stop the Titan Lord Mara. You arrive on Takarigua with Patty, and now you have to find Steelbeard, who's on the other side of the islands. You get to do a couple of simple quests with the Inquisition. These quests have a familiar Piranha Bytes feeling attached to them. The game offers you different choices in the dialogue with some actual consequences and a couple of different ways to do simple tasks. In true Piranha Bytes fashion, if you even look someone wrong, you'll get destroyed in combat. It's only worth fighting small critters, and even that can be deadly. So it's always better for you to do some simple quests and get some basic gear until you start exploring the island and try to reach the pirates on the other side. The games from this studio always try to make things pretty hard in the beginning when your character is weak and undergeared, simply because it's a great way for the player to get sense of the progression when he starts leveling up. Although the gameplay in Reason 2 is pretty much terrible, but we'll get to that soon. Here is something I didn't expect to experience in this game. The humor is pretty good, and it doesn't take long to stumble upon some very silly interactions between NPCs.
Let's get this f***ing sorted. Too f***ing right. So I'll go. F*** off, I'm going. Not f***ing likely, it's me that's going. Like, I'll go. F***ing dream on, I'll do it.
The dialogue is well written for the most part, so the jokes usually land well. It's a dry pirate humor, but that's exactly what it should be, right?
I would like a pistol.
Well, why didn't you say? Reckon you're a bit slow, son. Is there someone who looks after you?
Gods give me strength.
Some of the characters you're going to meet are pretty memorable because of this. There is a lot of swearing in the game, but it's usually pretty funny if you ask me. The dialogue with the gnomes and the natives can be hilarious sometimes. The natives seem to have their own language, at least parts of it I guess, but I like the efforts.
Capo, ono hamila gucho. What?
It makes the whole thing more believable and more immersive. The humor and the story in general were interesting enough to keep me entertained, and I can't say the same about the gameplay. Let's focus on becoming a pirate and actually doing the main quest. When you get to meet Steelbeard, he gives you a bunch of quests to complete before he allows you to join the pirates. These quests were nothing special, and meeting the pirates was okay at best. They have some believable problems, like all NPCs in Piranha Bytes games, and you're there to solve them. But I have a bone to pick with the whole becoming a pirate thing, surprise surprise. I mentioned some underwhelming features of the game already, but this is definitely one of the biggest undercooked features in the game. Shortly after you become a pirate, you also become a pirate captain with your own ship and different crew members that you can recruit. But there are no actual ship mechanics or gameplay. Sailing to different islands is done with a short cutscene. This is something they definitely improved in the sequel, but that's a topic for another video. Don't worry though, Reason 3 video is coming soon as well. Anyway, the main thing you would expect to do as a pirate captain is sailing and robbing people. The latter is technically possible, but everything related to naval gameplay is completely out of the picture, which by default makes Reason 2 a very bad pirate game. In moments like this, it feels like Piranha Bytes were a bit too ambitious with the pirate features. Naval gameplay is not easy to pull off in a game like this, and being a small studio with limited resources didn't help. But in other moments, it just feels like they lost the motivation to make this game in general.
What do you think I am, fucking stupid?
And again, I might be wrong. Maybe they just wanted to make a simple action adventure. But even if that's true, that alone can't justify every undercooked feature in the game. So you have to join Steelbeard's pirate crew. Steelbeard is a decent character overall.
Finally crawled out of your wanking pit, you pig-shagging landlubber! Only to see if the stories were true about you being sober, you rum-sodden old git! I'm wanting 2 crates, and I won't give you more than 7 for 'em, got it? So you're here to rob me then? 5 for 4!
He's one of few pirate captains that managed to resist Mara's influence. Other pirate captains are now protecting Mara, and you'll have to kill them in order to get all the artifacts. The pirate captains are essentially boss fights. The first one on the list is Captain Crow. Your next destination is Sore Coast Island, where you go with Steelbeard and Patty. You get to kill some pirates and natives upon arriving on the island, and for the next quest you'll have to continue alone. Story parts like this doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because why would Steelbeard send you and Patty alone? After all, he has a full crew of pirates on the ship who are kinda useless. But anyway, this is the part where you have to decide if you want to join the Inquisition again or side with the natives. Apparently you'll need some help in order to kill this crazy pirate captain, and that's the main reason for joining one of the factions. This island has quite a few quests that you can do, if you wish to. I did some of the optional quests, and once again I did enjoy them, but I never want to replay them, or this game in general, as a matter of fact.
Quite the joker, aren't you?
I decided to join the Inquisition again since I wanted to use muskets and shotguns. The range gameplay is slightly more enjoyable, so that was probably the main reason for that decision. Now, the natives offer you a totally different approach to the gameplay with voodoo magic. I can only speculate about this because I've never done a playthrough with the natives and I don't want to. But I wouldn't be surprised if the voodoo magic is the best way to experience the game, although that's not saying much since the problem with the gameplay is on the fundamental level. Other than that, your choice of joining a faction doesn't really matter a lot, and you'll soon get to forget it ever happened. You're going to interact with people from both factions regardless of your choice. The Inquisition on Sore Coast Island has a couple of memorable quests, like breaking one of the pirates from the prison with canyons. I didn't hate the quest here, but once again, very mediocre in general. This is one of the side effects of trying to have multiple small islands instead of one big island. It's much easier to create depth when you have 1 or 2 big locations like in Reason 1. Anyway, you gather the firing squad and it's time to face the first boss of the game. I'm guessing that if you side with the natives, this will be the same. You would only bring some native warriors with you. The boss fight was okay for Piranha Bytes standards, but kinda bad in general, to be honest. I will talk more about boss fights in the gameplay section. The harpoon you get for killing Captain Crow is one of 4 artifacts you need for killing Mara. You will need to get 3 more, so your next goal is obviously to collect the rest of them. Once you bring the good news about the first artifact you found to Inquisition, they want you to give them the harpoon because of the High Council orders. The people from High Council are pulling the strings when it comes to all important political matters in the world. But those rules don't apply to the mighty pirate captain, and this is also one of the turning points. It's the part where you get to assemble your pirate crew and get a pirate ship, simply because you don't agree with High Council. I keep forgetting to talk about Patty a little bit. You will have some companions in this game that you can bring with you at all times. I chose to stick with Patty because she's the most developed character in general. And no, I don't think that kind of development. You perv. Well, not until Reason 3 at least, when we can see, even bigger developments. Now where was I? Oh yeah, the pirate captain thing. Like I mentioned before, being a pirate or a pirate captain really doesn't mean anything in this game. I mean, yeah, you have some people on your boat that can be helpful at times and you can choose a follower. Patty, and I'm assuming all other followers, have unique dialogue lines in different situations and when talking to other NPCs. This was the first time that Piranha Bytes introduced such a feature.
Give up, this one's no help.
Nice try though, mate, nice try.
But there is one very obvious flaw with this new feature. The characters you're talking with will never acknowledge the existence of your follower, even when they say something to their face. Except in one particular situation, I guess.
A pirate? You got balls walking in here? And who's this? Your bit on the side?
Oh dear.
Excuse me?
She's my helmsman.
A woman on the helm? Now I've heard it all.
That was only the case in Reason 2. Reason 3 and both Elex games have a much more developed interactions between your followers and NPCs you talk with. But putting that aside, I like the idea of having a companion at your side, and if you don't, you can always choose to leave them on the boat. I mean ship. Whatever. It's a shitty ship anyway. Patty suggests to go back to Caldera and inform Carlos that Sebastian tried to take the harpoon from you. Sebastian is the commander of the Inquisition on the Sword Coast Islands. But I wanted to go on Antigua Island first, just because. Antigua is the headquarters of pirates, I guess. Admiral Alvarez is the old pirate who is in charge of this place, and he's a very traditional pirate. There is a thing called the Pirate Creed, which is essentially a set of moral rules that pirates should abide by. In other words, Alvarez is an old boomer who is pissed off that things are not the same anymore when it comes to how pirates behave.
Shit happens.
Shit like you couldn't imagine, my boy.
You overhear a conversation with Alvarez and Slane, another pirate, an important character for the main story. Slane apparently has one of 4 magical artifacts, and he didn't go crazy like other pirate captains. He's actually a wannabe pirate captain, according to Alvarez. Now, I will try to avoid all major spoilers, and I'll leave that for the spoiler section near the end of the video. Reason 2 has a handful of plot twists, but none of them were that effective if you ask me. You can also choose to skip the spoiler part when you get there by using the timestamps feature. So, I will purposely skip major plot twists while talking about the main quest in this part. Anyway, Alvarez knows that Slane has the artifact and he demands to give it to him, but Slane refuses. So you start working a bit with Slane and he tells you that the knife is on the Thieves' Islands. Before you get there, you have to do some filler quests for Slane's ship. After that's done, you sail away to Thieves' Islands. Now, this is probably the most interesting location you'll get to visit, not because of the island itself, but the people who live here. Well, gnomes to be more precise.
Fuck yes!
Gnomes have built a little village on this island, and you'll have to do some hilarious quests for them. Hilarious because of how they speak, the quests are pretty simple though. You even get one of them as a crew member, which is pretty cool. Gnomes are just NPCs you get to kill a lot in the first Reason game. It's nice to see them get some more character development in the sequels. My time spent on Thieves' Island was one of the highlights of this playthrough. It was not amazing, but a good change of pace, and it broke the monotony a little bit. After that was done, I went back to Caldera, the starting area of the game. But this time around, you have the access for the full city. You have a little chat with Commander Carlos and update him about what happened so far. The High Council decided to sign a treaty with Mara if they handle her all the magical artifacts that can be used to defeat her. I'm assuming the leaders of the High Council are imbeciles, because that sounds extremely stupid. Yeah, let's just give her all the items that can actually kill her, she will most definitely spare us. This opens up a lot more quests you'll have to do in order to collect all the artifacts. But first you'll need to find some clues about Captain Garcia, who went to the same place as Corrientes, another commander of the Inquisition. Corrientes is one of the main people who get to make decisions in the High Council as well. Before you can go after Captain Garcia, you'll need to find some clues about his location in Caldera. This place kinda looks cool, but it's really boring to explore, and it's just a means to an end. You can do some boring side quests here, but even this part of the main quest is very boring because it's just one piece of information. The location is totally underused. We can say the same about many similar locations. Most of them fail to feel immersive, like the majority of locations in Piranha Bytes games. Anyway, you find out that Garcia and Corrientes are in Maracas Bay, so that's your next destination. Maracas Bay is a slightly more interesting location to explore. You'll interact with the natives and the Inquisition here, and of course you can take some side quests to do here as well. But your main goal is to find Garcia and his artifacts. When you meet up with Corrientes, who sided with the natives of the island, he tells you that he's searching for the Fire Temple. More specifically, he's searching for the entrance. He will tell you how to get past the fire door if you find the entrance. Many quests in Reason 2 have quest markers, but only when it makes sense. You know nothing about the location of the Fire Temple, so there is no quest marker. You will have to explore the island and find it yourself. It's a decent system, which they used in Reason 1 as well. Finding what you're looking for in Risen 2 is very easy, since all of these islands have very narrow paths, it's hard to miss something. This part of the story has possibly the best plot twist, but that's not saying much. I said before that all plot twists were not that effective, and this one is just slightly better. It turns out Garcia buried his artifact on Antigua, behind the door, which requires a secret password. All hail Garcia. Yeah, that's the actual password. I skipped a couple of parts where we get to obtain the rest of the artifacts because of the spoilers obviously, but like I said, we'll get to that in the spoiler section. Now you finally have all the artifacts and you're ready to face Mara. Alvarez tells you that you need to find the location of the water temple because Mara retreated there. But in order to find this location, you will need to visit the Island of the Dead and find a way to enter the underworld. This is definitely the most interesting part of the main story, and you will learn the history behind magical artifacts that you collected through the entire game. It's connected to the natives that you'll meet in the underworld. Each artifact was in a possession of a different native, and they were cursed by Mara for betraying her. Their souls are left to wander in the underworld, so you'll need to save them by doing a simple quest for them. The events in the underworld foreshadows one of the major features in Risen 3. This place also has a quest for Bones, who becomes your main companion in Risen 3. So if you're going to play all Risen games, it's a cool connection between them, which you can probably appreciate. When you finally learn about the location of the water temple, you and your crew get ready to sail again. There is a fight with the Kraken, which is just a simple minigame basically, it's almost not even worth mentioning. The water temple looks pretty damn cool, but once again, it feels very underdeveloped. You would think you would need to do some serious dungeon crawling to get to Mara. I mean, look at this place. And speaking of dungeon crawling, I had some high praises for the first Risen game. Risen 1 still has the best dungeon crawling out of all Piranha Bytes games if you ask me. The underdeveloped nature of Risen 2 heavily affected this aspect of the game as well. As soon as you step in the temple, you get to fight Mara. You'll have some strong monsters to fight before that, which is pretty easy because your crew is helping you out. The fight with Mara is hands down the best boss fight in the game, but that's not saying much, it's still pretty bad. You kill her, and that will pretty much conclude the story of Risen 2.
Ha! There's a good story there.
I think it's pretty decent in general, and it has some memorable characters. The dialogue is well written for the most part, and voice acting is quite solid. It was a much more straightforward and linear story, which some people might prefer, but it's being held down by pretty much everything else in the game. This story would be much more enjoyable if the gameplay was able to support it properly. I will only remember a couple of things from the story of Risen 2 and some of the characters it introduced. To put it simply, I don't want to replay this game anytime soon. Which finally brings us to the gameplay.
Hit the ball.
If you're coming straight from Risen 1, I'm pretty sure you're going to be very disappointed with how this game plays. Risen 1 had a simple combo system which worked very similar to older GOTY games. You get to chain a couple of melee attacks, and the timing of button inputs was really important. It did take some time to get used to, and the controls felt a bit stiff, but it was a pretty decent combat system in general. Risen 2 kept some of that design philosophy, I guess, but the melee combat feels way worse for a couple of reasons. First of all, the controls are pretty similar to the first game, if not a little bit more responsive. However, we still have the same camera issues, like when your character is falling down, and the sensitivity settings are weird. You can only control the sensitivity of the horizontal movement for some odd reason, which leaves you with a very unbalanced sensitivity, especially if you like to turn it down a bit, like me. I got used to it eventually, but I was not happy to realize that even Risen 3 had the same issue. This is the first time I ever experienced a problem like this in games, ever. Anyway, since we mentioned the melee combat, let's continue that discussion for a little bit. Risen 2 still has a simple combo system, but your timing doesn't matter at all. They obviously wanted to make a more pirate style of combat with the swords, but that's not an excuse to almost completely ruin what you already established in the first game. NPCs will randomly parry you, your hits feel less impactful than in Risen 1, and the whole logic of this combat system is just very bad. To make things even worse, it encourages you to spam the attack button, basically. Since there are no penalties for doing it, and no resource you use for melee attacks, nothing is stopping you from spamming the button. You also have a dedicated button to fire your gun, or another gadget that you can loot, like daggers for example. It's really mind-boggling to me how worse this melee combat feels compared to the first game. I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but it really feels underdeveloped. That becomes to make even more sense when you start playing Risen 3, because the melee combat in that game feels like a deeper and more developed version of Risen 2. Speaking of depth, Risen 2 has some of it, but I'm going to show you why it doesn't matter at all. The idea for the character progression is essentially the same like in all Piranha Bytes games, except a couple of things. You gain experience, or glory as the game calls it, and you use it to increase one of your attributes. It's supposed to feel more RPG-ish, which I can definitely appreciate if it was actually done well. But it isn't, it barely feels like it makes any difference. By increasing your attributes, the level of skill goes up and it allows you to learn new skills by visiting certain trainers. The melee combat gets just a little bit better when you unlock kick and riposte, but it's still very bad. So I just decided to play the entire game with a musket and a shotgun, and just use the sword when needed. I used the second musket I got for the entire game basically. It's not so hard to kite enemies around by spamming the dodge button, which doesn't have any resource attached to it. You can exploit the enemy AI without even trying. They can easily get stuck on the terrain, especially if you use the verticality to your advantage. It reminds me of Gothic 3 a bit. Risen 1 had some of that, but the pathfinding for AI was much better, so it didn't happen that often, and it was harder to run away from the fights. In Risen 2, I just mag dump every single enemy in the game. This is something that Piranha Bytes improved quite a bit with their newer games. Almost all enemy in Elex games have some sort of a ranged attack, which prevents you to cheese the fights. Let me just demonstrate how bad some of these fights were. There are a handful of strong enemies like this, which are obviously not worth fighting at all, in the way that Piranha Bytes intended. And that's coming from me, a guy who actually enjoyed the melee combat in Elex, which also had its fair share of problems. But even besides those problems, you still had actual combat mechanics, which you can take the advantage of if you're willing to learn how it works. Clunky? Definitely. Janky? For sure. Stiff controls? Check. Even so, it was still functional. But Risen 2 melee combat is on the verge of being broken, especially when you're fighting creatures. Every smaller to medium creature will try to circle around you for absolutely no reason. There is a soft lock targeting system, so you don't exactly lose the target you're attacking, even if it circles around you like a moron. Some of them can have some sort of a charge attack, which is very poorly telegraphed. Those kinds of attacks usually just put you in a QTE event. Wonderful. Speaking of dodge, it's okay I guess, but it can also get you killed easily in some situations. The sidestep in Risen 1 worked a lot better to get out of the way of the attack, even though it felt a lot stiffer than dodge in Risen 2. Remember how you could just mow down a bunch of enemies at once in Risen 1? It was one of the features that made the melee combat a lot better, especially when you get a stronger two-handed weapon. You could also die easily if you miss your combo, or if you don't pay attention to your positioning. Risen 2 has none of that. The range of motion for attacks is horrible, no matter which melee weapon you use. The blade skills you can learn make the melee combat just a little bit better, but it's like putting lipstick on a pig. Overall, I was extremely disappointed with the melee combat. Using the gun instantly was something that I kinda like, and it would be okay addition to the melee gameplay if the melee gameplay was any better. So what about the range combats? Well, it's definitely better, but not by a large margin. The problems with enemy AI is just magnified when you use ranged weapons. You have to work a bit before you get your first musket, which was kinda cool. The game uses hit scan for landing shots, and each gun has a range stat to it, so you can miss the shots. I'm not sure if there is a random chance to miss the shot as well, because sometimes it seems like I'm close to the enemy and the shot still misses. But whatever, you're going to hit 90% of your shots anyway. You can learn some skills for the muskets and shotguns, but most of them are just for increasing the damage. The critical shot skill is pretty important if you want to use ranged weapons. The reload time is about 2 seconds, and they didn't even bother with a reload animation. Who in their right mind thinks that it's fun to take one shot every 2 seconds with literally zero variety in how the guns work? Well, me apparently, since I played the whole game like this. I thought the shotguns at least will work differently because, you know, they do in real life. But nope, it's just a slightly different sound effect for the gun, with less range and usually less damage. Range gameplay wasn't that good in Risen 1 as well. The magic was fine, but the bow and arrow gameplay felt very clunky. The muskets and shotguns are less clunky, but also less fun to use. When it comes to the progression system, they could totally remove it from the game and I probably wouldn't even notice. Literally the only fun skill to learn was the one that allows you to shoot someone in the face while talking to them. I learned this skill very early on, but I believe I only saw a couple of NPCs who gave me this option. You can find some more gadgets for combat like bombs, but I never really bothered to use them. Oh yeah, and some of those magical artifacts can be used as weapons, which was kinda cool, but not extremely useful. You would think that weapon which can kill Mara will one-shot regular people, but I understand why this was not possible to do because of the obvious balancing reasons. That's hilarious because the game suffers from poor balancing anyway. The boss fights in the game are very basic and they only rely on some gimmicky mechanics. Poke the giant stony boy and see Kraken in the mouth, those kind of mechanics. Along with some quick time events on top. Mara is pretty much the only real boss in the game and you get to fight her with no gimmicks. It's okay to have a gimmicky mechanic or two in a boss fight, but when the whole fight is based around it, that's never a good thing. Reason 1 suffered from the same problem, but only against the last boss in the game. Well, it was the one and only boss in the game, but still. I think Piranha Bytes could have easily made these artifacts more interesting to use, which would at least add some depth to the gameplay, but whatever. The last feature in which I'm extremely disappointed, surprise surprise, is the itemization in the game. Like I said, I finished the game with the second musket I ever bought. I only got to change my sword and a gun a couple of times. The variety of armor in the game is very bad as well. You only get to find a couple of NPCs who can sell you some unique looking armor. Getting new armor in PB games have always been important. It was tightly connected with the progression, which made you feel stronger and more confident to fight stronger enemies and explore harder zones. None of that is present in Reason 2. However, we can finally be at least a bit positive about one feature related to this. Reason 2 had a comprehensive list of legendary items that are scattered throughout the world. You learn about these items in various books you'll find, and collecting them is pretty fun and useful. They give you different stats, that's why they're useful, and they're not just a mindless collectible item. So there you go, something positive about the game. Whoop-de-fucking-do. Don't get used to it though.
The women might be nice to look at, but damn, they're slow.
I already covered some of the exploration in the story section, but we have to talk a bit more about it. If I was trying to convince you to play some of my favorite PB games, the exploration would be one of the first things I would mention. Reason 1 had a dense, decently sized island with a lot of verticality. It also made you use certain skills that you can acquire in exploration, which felt really cool. Even though it was just one island, there were a lot of different things to see. All important areas were carefully built to ensure that exploration feels great. All of that with no load screens at all, by the way. No matter if you enter a big dungeon and come out of it from a totally different direction, there are still no load screens. It was very immersive to say the least. And again, none of that is in Reason 2. You gradually unlock more islands to explore as the story moves along. Even when Reason 2 introduces some nice looking areas which could potentially be fun to explore, they always feel underdeveloped, like Caldera for example. When I unlocked the city, I thought I'm finally going to see an interesting area to explore, but nope. Same goes with pretty much every other major location. And again, some of them look cool, but all of them offer a very shallow exploration experience. The wilderness of pretty much all islands in the game feel copy and pasted. They just move some of the assets here and there, which makes them feel sameish. All of these islands have just a few narrow roads that you can take, so there isn't much to explore anyway. Sometimes you'll stumble upon a cliff that you can climb for some loot that can be useful, but it can also be a waste of time and not rewarding at all. Overall, it's the worst exploration experience from a Piranha Bytes game. Like I mentioned before, Reason 2 has a couple of plot twists, but none of them were that effective, to be honest. The first major plot twist is when Steelbeard gets killed by Mara, which happens not so long after you start doing the main quest. I really didn't care that much, because you don't spend a lot of time with this character. He's probably the best character in Reason 2, if I think about it. Well voice acted, good dialogue in general, but they decided to kill him off really fast, so whatever. You get to see him again for the final quest, because he's the one who tells you the location of the water temple. It was a cool scene with the ghost ship. The second plot twist was extremely obvious and very stupid. Captain Slane betrays you on the Thieves' Island by telling you to fetch the sacrificial knight while he's waiting at the entrance of the cave. Yeah, not suspicious at all. This is how you end up stranded on the island without the ship and your crew. You get to kill Slane later, because he's one of the Mara's bitches. Slane was an okay character, but nothing special. The best plot twist in the game was definitely when Captain Garcia killed Corrientes and took his place. You actually never got to meet real Corrientes, it was Garcia all along. I think that was pretty cool and I didn't see it coming. I guess that would be all, if I'm not missing something. The ending doesn't really have spoilers actually, you just kill Mara. She has one dialogue line which was very disappointing. I expected at least some evil monologue from her, but nope. That will conclude the spoiler section. The music in the game is not bad, and there are a few tracks that I like. But the soundtrack is very forgettable, especially compared to the soundtrack in Resident 1, which was amazing. I used that soundtrack for many videos that I did and for writing scripts. So yeah, not bad, but not that good either. The voice acting was surprisingly pretty decent in general.
That's for me to worry about. Just take me to Tacarigua.
That's your best man. Does the High Council know about this?
No, and there's no reason they need to. Let them take forever coming to a decision. We need to act now.
Nothing outstanding or anything, but very decent, especially for a AA RPG. You have pirates that talk very specifically, natives that have their own language, kinda, and gnomes that are just gnomes.
Fuck yes!
I enjoyed the voice acting and talking to NPCs in general, which can't be said the same about the sound effects. Combat sound effects are mediocre at best, or plain stupid in some cases. The environmental sound effects are very bland as well. Not a lot to say about this. To sum it up, Resident 2 was very disappointing, especially after such a strong beginning of a new IP with Resident 1. Instead of improving the already established features from the first game, they decided to scrap almost everything in favor of the new pirate setting. The pirate fantasy was also really poor. The ship was just a gimmick that you couldn't use, and you become a so-called pirate captain with no effort at all. Even though the story itself was kinda interesting, it doesn't make a lot of sense from the perspective of the first game. Literally every major feature from the previous game feels underdeveloped in Resident 2. The gameplay suffered the most for all the reasons I mentioned before. The only logical explanation would be if Piranha Bytes wanted to simplify the sequel. That could possibly attract more new players, at the cost of losing the identity and the charm of a Piranha Bytes game. However, that was quick to change in Resident 3, the last entry in Resident series. But that's a topic for another video, and I promise you won't have to wait for long to see it. Well, we came to the end of this video. Tell me your opinion about Resident 2 in the comments below.
Gods give me strength.
Do you think I was a bit too critical, or do you agree with most of what I said? Leave a comment down below. Even though Resident 1 had some notable issues, it was a very good RPG in general.
You telling tales now?
That game had a familiar set of rules, which Piranha Bytes established in their previous RPGs. Then came Resident 2, which was one of the most disappointing RPG sequels that I ever experienced.
Gods give me strength.
While it still had some of the recognizable RPG features, it also had a new design philosophy, which took this series into a completely new direction. It was kinda obvious that Piranha Bytes planned to do a trilogy, like they did with Gotti games. But after playing Resident 2 back in the day, I lost all hope for this series, so I didn't have high expectations for Resident 3.
Bloody fools!
However, there was one particular trailer for Resident 3 which raised my excitement levels quite a bit. That trailer was called Back to the Roots, and it seemed like Piranha Bytes acknowledged all the major issues from the previous game. The trailer promised 3 different factions that you can join and how important this is in the game. And if you remember, this was one of my major critiques for Resident 2, amongst other things. On the other side, Resident 3 also continued with the pirate setting that Resident 2 introduced, but with a brand new main character, which was surprising to say the least.
How long was I asleep?
The gameplay looked very similar, if not a bit smoother, and I was really excited for the introduction of a new faction that focused on magic. Voodoo magic from the previous game was never my cup of tea, while the melee and range gameplay had some serious issues. Long story short, I was willing to forget that Resident 2 ever existed if the sequel managed to be a big redeeming factor. Spoiler alert, it wasn't.
Bloody fools!
On the bright side, Risen 3 is everything that Risen 2 was supposed to be. Even so, this game felt really mediocre in general, and it failed to reach the quality levels of the first game in the series. Now, let's go back and start talking about all major features, starting with the graphics. First of all, I have to apologize for the footage I'm using, and let me explain why. I was playing the game on my PS5 and I used the default recording software. However, for some reason the PS5 recording software recorded the footage in 30 FPS, probably because that's how it used to work on PS4. The PS5 runs the game in locked 60 FPS mode, and you're going to see some of that footage as well. That's because somewhere near the end of my playthrough, my new capture card arrived, so I was able to record some footage with it. The reason why I didn't play it on the PC, because I had some issues with the drivers at the time. So yeah, sorry for that. This game looks way better on PC if you can run it in higher resolutions like 2K or 4K. I'll be using the variety of footage in this video, but the majority of footage will be from the PS5 playthrough. Anyway, at the first glance, it didn't seem like Risen 3 made some huge leaps on this field, because it didn't. This game used a lot of similar, if not the same assets like in the second game. That kinda makes sense if you think about it, because you're essentially exploring the same world map, or maps to be more precise. Risen 3 had the same islands to explore, and added some brand new ones, which are much better in general. I'll leave the technical side of discussion about the map for the gameplay section. Risen 3 definitely has a bit more vibrant color palette compared to the second game. As a result, the majority of islands you're going to explore have a much stronger tropical atmosphere. But more importantly, the visual variety is far stronger than in Risen 2. Risen 3 managed to drastically improve on this field by introducing shadow areas on all maps. Shadows are a new threat and a big chunk of the main story. These areas break the visual monotony, even though they are not very interesting by themselves. It's all doom and gloom, and it gets a bit boring after you visited a couple of these areas. But it's not just the shadow areas which contribute to the visual variety. There are plenty of other examples as well, like the volcano area on Caldera, or the whole Skull Island, which has a totally different atmosphere in general. Besides that, it's very noticeable from the very beginning that Risen 3 has way more details on the map. The vegetation is very lush, which by itself makes the game look much better than Risen 2 in many different areas. The graphical fidelity of character models is very easy to compare, because we have many returning characters in Risen 3. Some of those characters have been completely redesigned, and not for the better if you ask me. Except some particular body parts. No, but seriously, I think that Patty's character models was way better in Risen 2, it was a lot more stylish. As for the character models in general, they have some slight improvements, but it's nothing major. The visual improvement with the environments is much more noticeable. I guess the lighting is a little bit better as well, but that's pretty much it. That will be everything I want to cover when it comes to visuals. Overall, I think the game aged pretty good, especially if you can run it in 4K on PC. Like I said, 80% of the footage I'm using are from PS5, and the game looks a lot better on PC in general. This semi-realistic art style aged pretty well, and even the character models don't look that outdated because of it. Although your opinion about this may vary.
Oh, spare me your clever talk.
Risen 3 is not exactly a direct sequel, even though there is a bunch of returning characters. This time around, we're playing as a brand new character. You're the son of the famous Captain Steelbeard, the character we heard so much about in the first game from his daughter Patty. Then we got to meet him in Risen 2 and become a part of his pirate crew. I can't say for sure, but I definitely don't remember that anyone mentioned that Steelbeard had a son. This is also brought up by the previous nameless hero when you get to meet him in Risen 3.
I always thought old Steelbeard only had a daughter.
I only found out about this when I started doing research for the video, because I somehow missed him in the game. Yeah, you can meet the previous nameless hero from Risen 1 and 2, which is really freaking cool if you think about it. He also said that Patty never mentioned that she has a brother, and he tells you that he's on a secret quest or something. It's a very cool interaction, which can be considered as an Easter egg, I guess. Anyway, the new nameless hero doesn't leave good first impressions, especially because of the English voice acting.
What was that? I felt as if... There! Just then.
It seems like this dude who voiced him is trying really hard, which makes his delivery really silly most of the time.
Well, that cheers me up.
However, I started liking him a lot more as I progressed through the game. He can be extremely sarcastic and he swears a lot, which is obvious because he's a damn pirate.
Who dares touch my soul shard?
Oops, I think it was me.
And let's not forget the brilliant pirate dialogue in the previous game. It was hands down one of the best things about Risen 2.
Finally crawled out of your wanking pit, you pig-shagging landlubber! How did you see if the stories were true about you being sober, you rum-sodden old git? I'm wanting 2 crates, and I won't give you more than 7 for 'em, got it? So you're here to rob me then? 5 for 4!
Risen 3 continues in somewhat similar fashion, and the nameless hero made me laugh more than a couple of times.
You're a real smart guy, aren't you?
Up to this point, Piranha Bytes has drastically improved the writing in their games, which can sometimes be overshadowed by the subpar voice acting. There are some very cringy moments in the beginning of the game when you interact with Patty. The way her voice actress delivers the lines makes you think they're not actually brother and sister, if you know what I mean.
Well done. Let's move on, dearest brother, dearest brother.
Enough, I'm not here for sex.
I couldn't take the story seriously in those segments, and starting the game like this will only make you think how goofy the story is. Which is a shame because, like I said, the writing is very decent in all Risen games actually. Whatever, the game begins on the ship, you're fighting against a bunch of shadow creatures as well as a ghost of Captain Crow. If that name sounds familiar, that's because we already got to kill him in Risen 2. Captain Crow was essentially the first boss fight in that game, and not a very good one at that. He wasn't a very memorable character by any stretch of imagination, so I have no clue why they decided to bring him back. Not only for this tutorial segment, the ghost of Captain Crow plays an even bigger role in the story than he did in the previous game. You get to see him on the Crab Coast as well as in your dreams, but this ultimately leads nowhere.
That was him again. The ghost captain.
There is an actual fight with him in the last chapter, which is a carbon copy from the tutorial section. It's weird and a bit stupid, but we'll get to that eventually. I could think of at least a couple of more interesting characters they could have used instead of Captain Crow. For example, Captain Slane was a more charismatic and a lot better character in general, but whatever. After the nightmare with Captain Crow, your OnlyFans sister and you start exploring the Crab Island. This little island looks very good, and the way it was designed led me to believe that Risen 3 is bringing back some features from the first game. For example, the game teaches you how to use the parrot flight to reach a certain area, and you get to explore a dungeon. Using magic spells or scrolls to solve puzzles was a big deal in Risen 1, and the dungeon crawling was really good in that game. Risen 2 almost totally disregarded those features, and then we have the sequel that opens up by bringing back some of those features. Well, that's what you would expect, right? When the tutorial of the game focuses on those elements, you would expect them to be a big deal later in the game. The dungeon was really simple and straightforward, but it led me to believe that we're going to experience much better dungeon crawling than in the second game. Spoiler alert, that never happened.
If you say so.
Putting that aside, your whole reason for visiting this island is to find treasure. I mean, you're a damn pirate, so it's obvious. You stumble upon this huge ancient temple, which ends up being very disappointing to explore. I had a similar critique for the Temple of Mara in Risen 2. They show you this huge temple with many different levels, but you only get to explore 10% of it. Ilex 1 and 2 and even Gothic 3 had a much better sense of scope, because if the place looks explorable, it usually is. The vertical exploration was much better in those games in general. Anyway, you get to do a simple puzzle and kill a couple of enemies in this ancient temple. I mean, sure, it's the tutorial, so you shouldn't expect anything crazy. But like I said, I expected to see a much better dungeon crawling in this game. Unfortunately, that never happened, and neither did the clever usage of game mechanics for solving puzzles. There is some puzzle solving, which ended up being a lot worse somehow. The dungeon crawling in this game is definitely better than Risen 2, but that's not saying much. Both of those features are laughable compared to Risen 1. To go back to the main story, at the end of the ancient temple you get to fight a couple of shadow creatures from your dreams. More importantly, you stumble upon a portal and a Shadow Lord appears. This creature ends up killing the nameless hero, and it also takes his soul, which turns into a huge plot device. Shadowlord then pieces out, and Patty and your crew buries you on the beach.
Goodbye, dearest brother.
By the way, Shadowlord would never do this in an actual fight. He would try to kill everyone, but whatever. We know that Patty has a huge breast, plot armor.
Wanna try being a bit more polite?
So, you're dead even before the game begins, but all of a sudden this weird guy called Bones revives you somehow. He explains that something similar happened to him before and that he only managed to save your body and not your soul. This is where Reason 3 introduces a brand new morality feature. There are a bunch of dialogue options which will affect your soul points. You'll either gain some of them or lose them. There is also this gauge that's like a status of your soul level, but ultimately this feature ends up being very underdeveloped. It doesn't matter how you treat most NPCs, no matter how big or small your soul level. The morality system won't affect your relationship with NPCs, and it has nothing to do with how you make important decisions in the game. There are only a couple of NPCs that can leave your crew at the end if your soul level is really high or really low. But even that is like, whatever.
Don't push me too far, boy.
On a side note, Ilex will reintroduce this morality feature and build upon it quite a bit. It affects major story decisions as well as how the game ends. Then we got Ilex 2, which also has its own morality system that matters. To go back to Reason 3, there are no actual repercussions for being an asshole in dialogue, and you should always select such options. Well, it might lead you to a fight or two, but choosing those dialogue options are very entertaining.
Go fuck yourself.
Right, even though the morality system is not important at all, the story hyper-focuses on the fact that you don't have a soul. One of the main quests is to find a way to retrieve your soul from the underworld, and Bones is supposed to help you a lot with this. Speaking of Bones, he's hands down the best supporting character in the game, in every sense of the word. He's well voice acted.
It's funny that you're talking about him. I thought I saw one of Mendoza's ships recently west of Tyrannus.
Well written, interesting and goofy, and he's also very helpful in fights. Up to the point where Reason 3 feels way easier than it should be, but we'll get to that when we start talking about the gameplay. If you cared enough for Reason 2 for whatever reason, you might remember Bones. He looked different though, but there was a memorable quest with him that you could easily miss. I think one of the biggest weaknesses of Piranha Bytes story writing is the lack of memorable characters. It's not like Reason games don't have any memorable characters, but they are few and far between. Bones is definitely one of the most, if not the most memorable character in Reason 3. He tells you that you need a powerful druid that can help you to retrieve your soul. Besides that, he also tells you about different factions that you can join, and it's all up to you from this point on. The game opens up completely, and your quest log will quickly fill up to the point where it can be hard to tell what is pushing the story forward, because you get multiple branching main quests. For this playthrough, I decided to join the mages and try out the magic playstyle. Last time I played I went with the demon hunters and a melee oriented build, and I never actually finished the game with the mages. Reason 3 is really impressive when it comes to these choices because of the sheer amount of options you have. The game feels almost completely different depending on the faction you choose. I mean, the game ends up playing out the same at the end, regardless of your faction choice. However, I think that most people would agree that the journey is far more important than the destination itself. That's essentially the biggest strength of Piranha Bytes games in general.
If you say so.
All factions in the game have their personal issues and goals, but they all share one common problem: the shadow creatures which are swarming every island. No matter whom you join, this will be your biggest problem as well. So yeah, I started working towards joining the mages, and if you played at least one game from this studio, you'll know what to expect. People will give you a hard time at first, and you'll need to do some busy work for the faction. Mages are crazy about collecting magic crystals, which is the source of their magic powers. Crystal magic is nothing new, but it was totally disregarded in Reason 2. In Reason 1 you could join the Inquisition and learn how to use the crystal magic. In this game, however, the Mages and the Inquisition are different factions, they are no longer working together. The Inquisition is still there in Reason 3, but they are no longer a proper faction. There are still quests related to them, and you will need to recruit them eventually. Speaking of which, one of your main goals is to unite all factions under your banner in order to fight the shadows. You'll also need the help of powerful mages from each faction in order to restore your soul. In between that, you can stumble upon a large quantity of side quests on each island. Much more than in Risen 2, it can even be a bit overwhelming to some people. I personally love when RPGs do this because it gives me a huge sense of freedom, which is something I want to see in an open world RPG. Most of the side quests are not that deep, but the writing makes them a bit interesting in general. For example, in my case, the majority of quests on Caldera with the mages are related to gnomes. These little assholes got revamped in Risen 2, and they were one of the best things about that game in general.
Fuck yes!
In this game, they kept the same writing style for the gnomes, they are still really silly. The mages are using them as slaves, pretty much, but they're too dumb to understand that.
What are you talking about, short ass?
When you finally do enough quests to join a faction, you get your first rank and a new armor set. There are 3 ranks in each faction, and between those ranks you have to do some more quests for a faction. No matter which faction you join, you have to do quests for all factions, eventually. That's because you'll need the help of their leaders to fight the shadows and retrieve your soul. The main story of Risen 3 feels very disjointed. It's all over the place, literally, because you'll have to visit all islands in order to progress. Meanwhile, almost every time you go to sleep, the nameless hero has these nightmares about the underworld, where he meets long-dead characters. A couple of those characters are well known, like the Inquisition Mendoza from the first game, or the hero's dad, the mighty pirate Captain Steelbeard, as well as some titans from previous games. I think this was pretty cool, and it adds a bit of mystery on top of the main story. All of this is obviously the side effect of having no soul, and the game constantly tries to warn you about this so that you can focus on that quest, I guess.
Oh, I'm completely fucked.
It turns out these are actual memories from your soul that's been wandering the underworld, but you only get to learn this near the end of the game. It was very obvious, and I don't even consider it a spoiler.
If you say so.
When you finally manage to help every faction and solve their personal issues, you can focus on restoring your soul. Mind you, all of this is happening in the span of 4 different chapters. The second chapter begins right after you leave the Crab Coast, and that's where you have to help every faction, regardless of whom you join. You're going to do a lot more quests for the faction you join though, in order to progress through the ranks. The third chapter requires you to find a special spell, which should help you to restore your soul. Druid Eldrick, the leader of the Demon Hunters, is supposed to perform the ritual, but he'll need the help of other powerful mages. Zachariah from the mages is focused on the big magic contraption called the Reactor. It's supposed to keep the titans away, I guess, although it ends up having a completely opposite effect. You have to help Zachariah by activating monoliths on the island, which should activate the reactor. This sends you on a mission to get the monolith stones, which you'll need for activating the monoliths. The monoliths are a nice excuse to explore the whole island. On the other side of the world, you need to recruit Chani, who is a powerful native mage from Kila Islands. Even getting to Chani requires you to do a couple of quests, and she also won't agree to help you until you deal with her biggest issue. The natives have a problem with Morgoloth, the oldest creature in the world, which natives are worshipping. Which turns out to be a huge fucking spider, for some reason, because every RPG needs to have them, in one way or another.
Go fuck yourself.
In order to bring peace, you need to fight the spider, obviously. Piranha Bytes have never been very good with boss fights, so don't expect much. However, I hated this fight a lot less compared to, well, pretty much all boss fights from other Piranha Bytes games. It's essentially a fight focused on ads that Morgoloth is summoning, and whenever you get some downtime, you have to deal damage to the spider. Up to this point, I had a powerful Rain of Fire spell, and my magic glove also deals some serious damage. I failed a couple of times, because when multiple enemies hit you in this game, it's very easy to get stun locked. I also played on the hardest difficulty, by the way, but we'll soon get to the gameplay discussion. Here comes an interesting story segment that's not necessarily related to the main story. Morgoloth is the oldest creature in the world, and you get to ask a couple of questions when you defeat it. Morgoloth thinks that people have changed, and that's why her creatures are attacking the people on the islands. Here comes a very stupid part. Even though Morgoloth is the oldest creature, it somehow doesn't know about the shadow creatures, and you have to explain what's going on. That's pretty stupid, especially coming from a creature that claims to know the secret of the universe.
What the fuck are you talking about?
Anyway, there is another Shadow Lord in the vicinity of the cave, and Morgoloth wants you to kill it, and only then you'll get the help you need. As for the questions about the universe, the answers you get are really vague.
But if these instruments could be found, the gods will return.
They have not been among us for an age. They are gone. Deal with it, human.
Okay. I said that this part is interesting, but I take it back. It could have been way more interesting if we got better answers about the lore. The main reason you're here is because Morgoloth can provide you with a magical barrier, which will protect you while the mages are performing the ritual. Speaking of which, you need to get Zachariah, Eldrick and Channy here and finally start the ritual. It was very obvious that something will go wrong with the ritual, you can see it from miles away. But it wasn't that obvious what's exactly going to happen. Before we get to the spoiler section, this would be a good time to talk about what happens in between these big story events. Risen 3 tried to improve the naval gameplay, but you're still not able to use the boat as you would expect. The sailing between islands is still done by a load screen, just like in the second game. However, this time around there are segments in the game which require you to use the naval gameplay features. It starts off by fighting the Kraken, you steer the boat and try to hit the Kraken with the cannons. It's very hard to die in these segments, and the whole fight feels very tedious. Especially when you consider that you have to repeat the same fight 3 times. It's very stupid.
Looks like it. You'd better prepare well.
Besides the Kraken, you'll have similar gameplay segments like from the tutorial. Like I said before, the fight against Ghost of Captain Crow is a carbon copy of the tutorial. Even the tutorial hints are still there, it's really lazy. Game, I'm 20 hours in, I know where the pistol button is, for f***'s sakes.
Hurry up!
On the other side, there is a fight that requires you to use some more special gameplay features, like the canyons, where you have to dodge and shoot, and get rid of the bombs from the ship. Overall, it's a cool idea, and they at least try to implement some actual naval gameplay features in a pirate-based setting. Even though these segments are really repetitive, and they basically use the same set piece. By the way, I almost had a game-breaking bug on PS5 in one of these segments. After the fight, I would end up floating in the air and I couldn't do anything. I had to use some instructions that I found on the Steam forums, which fixed the issue, but still, it's worth mentioning. From this point on, I must warn you about the spoilers, and you can skip this part if you wish by using the timestamp. Everything else about the main story can also be considered as a spoiler, even though I don't think it's a big deal. But like I said, here is your chance to skip it if you plan to play this game for the first time. The ritual goes terribly wrong, because instead of retrieving your soul from the underground, you retrieve this weird looking old dude who turns out to be a Titan Lord. Okay. His name is Necrolot and he's the Titan of Deaths. He captures the mages who performed the ritual so he can harvest their power. Apparently he altered the spell used in the ritual with the help of one of your crew members called Horace. Or as I like to call him, Horace. I'm stupid. Before you go to the Skull Island, which is the endgame location, you have to deal with Horace the traitor. He retreated to Island of Taranis and he caused even more trouble. He summoned an Ore Titan with the help of the Mage's Reactor. This is supposed to be another boss fight, but it's more like a puzzle you have to solve. You can't actually fight the Titan, you have to bind his hands by aiming the magic chains at his body parts. It's very stupid and tedious. When you kill Horace, you can see the reason for his betrayal. He was promised to become a Titan Lord himself. He was basically a moron. So, the last chapter takes place on the Skull Island, which looks very different compared to all the islands you explored so far. Your main goal is to save the mages that Necrolot has captured, and you came here with a big fleet.
Wanna try being a bit more polite?
You end up doing most of the things yourself anyway, but I think they did a better job than in Risen 2. You get this pretty big endgame island to explore, and your crew is much bigger and more interesting. Speaking of which, remember when I said that some of your crew members may be affected by your soul level? Well, one of them is Mendoza, and I think my game was a bit buggy in this segment. Bones told me that Mendoza left our crew, even though he didn't, he was right there. Besides the main quest, you also have some side quests on the Skull Island, but to be honest, I didn't bother a lot with that. Up to this point, I really wanted to finish the game. The 3 mages that you have to rescue are scattered on different parts of the map. The island is filled with high-level monsters, but nothing that you haven't seen before. You also have to do some puzzles, which are kinda annoying, but not very hard, so whatever. Like I mentioned before, the quality of puzzles and dungeon crawling is nowhere near the quality we experienced in Risen 1. Another big turning point for the story on this island is your soul. Finally, you get to meet with your soul and even talk to it. I found this segment really stupid, but in a slightly entertaining way, I guess. The voice actor for the nameless hero grew on me, so it was funny to hear him talking to himself like a moron.
And it turns out, you've been here all along. Why did that take so long? It's all very well for you.
Anyway, Necrolord bound the soul to commit suicide if you try to enter the fortress before you free the mages. We already did that, so in we go. We're finally reconnected with our soul and we're ready to face Necrolods, a very underwhelming bad guy who's supposed to be a titan. I have to say that I'm not a huge fan how Piranha Bytes did titans in this game. In Reason 1, the Titan Lords sounded like an extremely powerful entities with a dose of mystery around them. And even though the fight with the Titan at the end was disappointing, the presentation was pretty cool. It's something you would expect from a Titan, or at least that's pretty close to what I expected. The fight with Mara in Reason 2 was also okay, thematically and presentation wise I mean, but this is where it started going downhill. And here we have Reason 3, where the main bad guy is an old bald dude. Oh but wait, he turns into a monster that's literally the Shadow Lord in a different skin. Whoop-de-fucking-do. He doesn't even have to say much to you, besides that he wants to become more powerful and destroy the human race, pretty much. It's a very generic bad guy with almost zero depth and character development. And the fight, oh boy, it's the most frustrating fight in the game. That's because he keeps summoning a gazillion of monsters to fight you. And these are not little spiders like in the spider boss fight, these are the strongest freaking monsters in the game. To add salt to the wound, you have to chase him around the cave while he also heals by abusing your corpse. Yeah, you heard that right. You play as a soul version of yourself in this fight because, once again, your soul and your body get separated. They're really milking this plot device, but whatever. Once you get to kill him, there's a short cinematic, and according to Reason Wiki, it should play out differently depending on your soul level. But my game just immediately cuts to the credits, even though I'm pretty sure I didn't click anything. It's not a big deal, but still, it's worth mentioning. And there you go, that's the story of Reason 3. To sum up the story without spoiling anything, I think Reason 3 was pretty mediocre in general. I still can't decide if it was worse or better than Reason 2, but it's pretty close. There are much different games in general, and the story in Reason 3 feels a bit all over the place. On the other hand, you get an impressive amount of freedom in Reason 3, and you can choose which quest to do in whichever order you like. You're just limited with some quests that will trigger the next chapter. Reason 2 was way more linear, which made the story a bit more engaging, in a way. And let's not even talk about Reason 1, which did a much better job with the story in general, even though it felt a bit unfinished in later chapters. Reason 3 had some memorable characters, and it brought back meaningful faction choices. But if you think about it, the best characters in the game are the returning characters like Bones, Captain Alvarez, and Mendoza. The rest of the characters in your crew are not bad, but they're not very good either. This is not exactly anything new in Piranha Bytes games, they always had just a few memorable characters, even in gothic games. Anyway, there is only one very weak plot twist, and like I said, the main bad guy was very generic. In the end, the story in this game felt painfully mediocre, which made me want to finish the game as soon as possible when I reached Skull Islands. That was never the case with Reason 1, quite the opposite, I wanted to see at least one more chapter in that game. Now let's finally talk about the gameplay.
I'm going to crush a few skulls now.
Reason 3 takes the same gameplay formula from the last game and improves it quite a bit, at the cost of having some brand new issues. It also introduces some new mechanics and features, for better or worse. Let's start with the controls first. Unfortunately, the sequel has identical issues with the controls, like Reason 2. You can only control the sensitivity of the horizontal movement, which creates a huge imbalance that can be extremely frustrating, especially if you like to reduce the sensitivity of the camera a little bit, like me. I don't know what's up with Reason games and the sensitivity options, because even Reason 1 had some serious issues on the Xbox 360. You get used to it, but that's not an excuse for the lack of fundamental settings for controls. As for the responsiveness of the controls, it's noticeably better than Reason 2, and it's way smoother. Reason 2 had very stiff controls, which made the combat really clunky. The sequel is much more responsive, and now we have brand new animations for all combat styles, except the range gameplay with the musket. Magic Spells has some very cool animations, which are quite possibly the best combat animations that Piranha Bytes ever had in their games. Even their newer games didn't have such good combat animations, so I'm wondering why they didn't try to replicate this in their newer games. These new shiny animations for spells are one of the major reasons why I wanted to join the mages in this playthrough. The melee combat system is also completely redesigned. The combo system is back, but it feels way more fluid and flexible. You can easily perform a melee combo by pressing the attack at the end of the animation, and even switching between enemies in the middle of the combo feels pretty good. The timing of your combo is not as precise like in Reason 1, but it's way better than Reason 2. If you press the button late, your combo will be slower, but the game usually doesn't punish you for that mistake. Reason 1 was a lot more punishing when it comes to this, which made the melee combat more intense. Reason 3 allows you to hold the attack button for a stronger attack. Not only for the first attack in the combo, you can do this for every attack, which makes combining normal and strong attacks very seamless. The more you hold the button, the more damage you deal, and the last attack in the combo is always the strongest. It also guarantees the knockback effect, which encourages you to finish the combo.
Take a swing!
These are some welcoming changes, and it adds a much needed dynamic to melee combat system. Humanoid NPCs will also use the same set of rules. I play this game on the hardest difficulty, for the most part. Reason 3 has a bug that will reset the difficulty to normal after you load the game. I had to increase the difficulty god knows how many times while I played, and sometimes I just forgot. The difficulty only seems to affect the health and damage of enemies though. The problem is, Reason 3 is not very challenging, even on the highest difficulty. I would even say it's the easiest game that Piranha Bytes ever made. That becomes very obvious from the beginning, because you can stumble upon some endgame monsters basically, and still manage to kill them. Reason 3 gives you a very strong companion from the start, so that's one of the reasons for that. Having such a useful follower from the beginning of the game heavily affects the difficulty of the game. You can always choose to leave your follower behind, but having them in your party is more entertaining. But even if you play alone, Reason 3 lacks the sense of danger in the world, which Piranha Bytes games are known for. I mean, you're still going to get destroyed without any armor or a proper weapon in the beginning, but right after you equip yourself a little bit, half of the game becomes a joke. Since I played a musket-oriented character in Reason 2, I wanted to test it out a little bit in the sequel. Before I joined the mages and started dumping my points into that playstyle, I played around with ranged weapons a little bit. The AI is much smarter now, so you can't exploit it that easily, but it's still possible to cheese a lot of fights if you try hard enough. It's nowhere near the level of Reason 2, which had brain-dead AI, which you could exploit without even trying. The gameplay with ranged weapons feel pretty much the same, there are no reloading animations, and the impact is very similar. You can still try to make this playstyle viable, even though the Inquisition is not exactly a major faction anymore. As soon as you join the mages and learn at least one magic glove spell, you'll immediately trivialize most combat encounters. These are like melee spells, which don't have a huge range, but still, it's very OP. You're able to control the whole battlefield of enemies when you get the hang of it. Like I said, the last hit in the combo will send enemies on the ground, and hey, look at this, the AoE damage is back. Remember how Reason 2 didn't have any AoE damage for melee or range attacks, even though Reason 1 had such mechanic? Well, Reason 3 brings it back, and it's better than ever. However, since the game lacks two-handed weapons in general, the AoE damage is much better on spells like Magic Glove. Using the Magic Glove spell feels way better than any melee weapon in the game. On the other side, if you join the Demon Hunters, you will improve your melee playstyle quite a bit, but still, it's not as good as the Magic Glove spell. The sense of impact with this spell is impressive. The sound and visual effects, along with the great ragdoll animations, make this spell very enjoyable to use. The problem with this spell is that combat turns into a spamming fiesta because of the pushback effects. Only so much bigger enemies will be able to resist the pushback from the spell, but like I said before, the last hit in the combo will always result in a pushback. Not to mention the stronger spells you get to learn, like Fire Rain, which not only deals a good amount of damage, but it also stuns all enemies repeatedly. I think this makes the progression system way worse, because you don't get to gradually increase the strength of your character. You're very weak in the beginning, but only after a couple of hours you feel like you can kill most enemies in the game. Except a couple of strongest NPCs that can always give you some trouble, because they can one or two shot your character. Even those creatures fail to feel dangerous if you have a follower by your sides. For example, these Shadow Lords are supposed to be very hard, but they're just not. I think I had the most trouble against this creature, because dodging his hits is almost impossible sometimes. Speaking of which, the dodge button is very responsive. It gets even better if you choose to play with Demon Hunters, because your dodge turns into a short teleport, and I'm pretty sure you get some iframes with it. The regular dodge doesn't have any iframes, so using it sometimes can only make the fight feel worse, like against the creature I mentioned. Especially because most enemies attack really fast, and you can easily get stun locked. It really feels bad when this happens, but it won't happen a lot if you adopt a more aggressive playstyle. Even though AI is much better in general, NPCs will usually just stand there and stare at you while you bash in the skull of their friends. Enemies can also perform a stronger attack in a combo, and it's very easy to tell because they have the same visual effect. These are quite possibly the best telegraphed melee attacks in a Piranha Bytes game. The AI is just way too passive, which is definitely one of the reasons for the lack of challenge. They should be way more aggressive, at least on the highest difficulty. They acknowledge this issue in Elex by adding a separate option in the menu so you can control how aggressive the AI is. Although once again, Elex came with some brand new issues because Piranha Bytes like to start from the scratch with their new IPs. Anyway, the sound effects for these spells pack a decent punch, which make them feel impactful. Melee sound effects are definitely a bit worse, but it's still better than Risen 2. A little bit better. Then we have the quick slot bar, which allows you to map your consumables, spells and weapons, and it makes the combat faster in general. However, it looks kinda clunky, because it always zooms in when you press the command to use something from it. You have to hold the quick slot button and then select the desirable option, which will always zoom in the wheel. It's not a huge issue, but it makes this feature feel unpolished. The pistols are back, and they are pretty much the same. I didn't use them that much, but it can definitely complement your melee combo if you wish to use them. I just love how the nameless hero can dance between multiple opponents in combat, because switching targets have never been easier in a Piranha Bytes game. But if I had to choose, I would still go for a more stiffer melee combat like in Risen 1, but with a greater sense of weight. I know I said that Risen 3 had a decent amount of weight behind the spells, but the melee combat is still a bit floaty. It's not essentially devoid of sense of weight, but Risen 1 still did a much better job with this. Jumping around enemies and charging your melee attack feels pretty good though. However, the lack of melee weapon types with different fighting styles really hurts the melee combat. All the spells that you can learn are pretty useful in general, but I wish they focused on the fundamental melee mechanics a bit more. When it comes to progression, it's very similar to Risen 2, but more robust. You gain glory for everything you do in the game, and you spend it to learn new skills and improve your attributes. This time around, there is an extra layer of progression with the factions. For example, if you join the mages, you need to collect magic crystals to learn new spells. You won't have a lot of problems with that, as long as you do quests for the faction. Progressing through the ranks in the faction is back, and it's certainly a welcoming feature. This is one of the staples of PB's game design, but for some reason it was absent in Risen 2. Once again, I think they simply tried to make a more straightforward, simplified action adventure with Risen 2. But even so, that game had some huge issues with the design in general. Anyway, getting a new rank in your faction is not exactly a big deal in this game. The best thing about it is getting a new armor set, which looks cool, but that's pretty much it. This issue circles back to the lack of challenge discussion we had before. Gacha games and Risen 1 offer you some very strong sense of progression, but that's not the case with Risen 3. You'll still get the feeling of getting stronger though, but it's not as strong as the games I mentioned. The spell variety with the mages is not that great either. You have different versions of the glove spell, fire rain, healing, and a couple of more not so useful spells. To be fair, some of the monsters are totally immune to certain elements, so you can't always use the same spell. In those situations, I would rather switch to my melee weapon than using a different spell. I wish they even went further with this, because it would probably fix the overpowered glove spell. If more enemies would be immune to certain elements, it would encourage the player to learn and use more spells. Same goes for the melee damage. I really wish they went deeper with this concept, but they didn't. So what about the exploration? Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's much better than Risen 2. The lackluster exploration was one of my biggest problems with Risen 2. Every island you could explore felt extremely linear, with almost nothing interesting to see or find. That was shocking in a way, because one of the major reasons why I love RPGs from this studio is the exploration. Luckily, Risen 3 redesigned the old maps in the game and added some brand new ones, which are much better in general. They have more paths to take and stuff to find off the beaten paths. These maps are much wider and less linear than before, along with the visual changes we talked about in the beginning of the video. I also love how some of the quests give you an extra reason to explore certain areas on the map. This time around, the vertical exploration is also much stronger. There are some areas which are not accessible before you do something, like progress through the main story or with the faction of your choice. The concept of quote-unquote upper city is something that I always liked in GOTY games, and it's kinda back in Risen 3. Not to that extent though, but still.
Stop!
Besides the old islands from Risen 2, Risen 3 introduces a couple of brand new ones as well. Taranis, Calador and Kila are 3 new major locations you can explore. All of these islands do a much better job in general than anything you could explore in Risen 2. They have distinctive visual variety, which make them feel unique, and vertical exploration is pretty good as well. For example, Calador has these recognizable green flames, and it's really mountainous. The green flames are from demon hunters who are trying to summon their warriors. Taranis Island is the mage's territory, and it has this shield in the sky. Kila Island is like a bigger forest area, and there is a secluded second area that you can't reach right away. There was another big island which was added in the DLC for the game, called the Fog Island. This island is interesting to explore, and the quests are okay, but it's nothing amazing.
Get a move on.
There are some caves and dungeons here and there, and they're okay at best. Risen 1 really left me hungry for more when it comes to dungeon design. Overall, I did enjoy the exploration in this game. They managed to make the same islands way more compelling to explore, and they added even more interesting islands on top of that. Even though I did enjoy the exploration in Risen 3, I still think Piranha Bytes excels when they only have a single map to work with. The disjointed exploration in Risen 2 and 3 is only justified by the pirate setting. I would have fewer problems with that if the pirate mechanics and features were actually good.
What are you talking about, short ass?
The music and sound in the game can be described in the exact same manner like the game itself. Very mediocre and kinda forgettable. I already praised some sound effects in combat, like the magic glove spell. However, pretty much all other sound effects are serviceable at best. As for the music, there are only a handful of tracks that are kinda memorable. Again, that's really disappointing considering the amazing soundtracks from Risen 1 and all GOTY games. That being said, I wouldn't call the music bad in Risen 3, but it's nothing you would remember long after you finish the game. The voice acting is a mixed bag. I said before that the nameless hero sounds very goofy, because he does.
You're a real smart guy, aren't you?
But I started liking him more and more, but that's probably because of the writing itself, and some of his delivery is pretty decent. Especially when he acts like an asshole, which is very common actually.
Well, I'd say that you need a strong arm. Let me guess, I need a fucking pickaxe. Exactly.
A couple of other characters like Bones, Captain Alvarez, and some mages have very solid voice acting.
Weren't we the ones who still sailed the seas until the great battle against Mara?
We? What the fuck do you mean by we?
While other NPCs are mostly okay.
Do you know what I'm lacking?
No.
A ring. I want a ring, and I don't want just some bauble. It has to be gold.
You should hurry. Never leave a lady waiting.
I think this was a turning point for all AA RPGs when it comes to voice acting. Elex 1 and 2, as well as some other AA RPGs like Greedfall, had some very solid voice acting. To conclude this review, I still think that Risen 3 was painfully mediocre.
If things carry on like this, I'm in deep shit.
It's not a game that I will think about after I'm done with the playthrough. But then again, I had some fun with it, even though I started getting bored as soon as I arrived on the Skull Island. I'm glad they left this series behind and started something new, but I always think about what could have been. What could have been if they just built upon Risen 1 and improved that concept like they did with Gothic 2. For some reason, Piranha Bytes always tries to do so much with their new games instead of building upon what they already have.
What the fuck are you talking about?
So, would I recommend Risen 3 today? It depends, I guess. If you already played previous 2 games, you should definitely give this game a try. If you want to get into this series, just go and play Risen 1 first, and if you like it, maybe just skip the second game entirely. Trust me, you won't miss that much.
Gods give me strength.
You could try Risen 3 after the first game if you like what I had to say about it. And that will conclude my retrospective series about Risen RPGs.
Wanna try being a bit more polite?
It's insane to me how different the first game is in terms of the setting and more importantly, the quality in general. We know that some key people like Mike Hodge left the studio somewhere in between Risen 2 and Risen 3 developments. Piranha Bytes continue making RPGs, but we got something totally new from this studio, although that's a story for another video. Tell me which Risen game you enjoyed the most, if any. And if you like the video, please subscribe for more. I also have some brand new t-shirt designs in the theme of the channel. You can find a bunch of different designs and it's a very nice way to support the channel and get something in return. You can always become a Patreon or a YouTube member and get some cool loyalty badges and emotes. But as always, watching the video is the most important thing. Many thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.